Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It had been a long day. Too long, in fact. Michael Grant stood on the darkened platform, the flickering street lamps casting ghostly shadows on the cold concrete beneath his feet. The wind had a sharp edge to it, biting at his skin, but he didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, distracted by the relentless hours that had bled into one another. His eyes were tired, his body exhausted, and the familiar weight of his briefcase felt heavier than ever as he waited for the last train home. The night had swallowed the town whole, leaving only the cold hum of distant city lights and the occasional gust of wind to break the silence. The platform was nearly deserted, just a few tired commuters and an old man huddled against the station's wall, seemingly asleep. Michael had expected the train to be packed, but instead, the station felt abandoned, like a forgotten relic of another time. It didn't bother him. He liked the quiet. He glanced at his watch, 11:50 p.m. The train was supposed to arrive at midnight, but this was the last one. He'd had to rush through the final meeting, his mind foggy and his thoughts scattered. There was something about tonight that felt off, something unexplainable. Maybe it was the gnawing feeling that he was running out of time, like a deadline he couldn't quite place. With a sigh, Michael turned his attention back to the tracks. The station seemed darker than usual, the shadows on the platform stretching unnaturally. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, trying to ward off the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the weather. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the headlight of the train. A single beam of light cutting through the night. It wasn't much at first, just a faint glimmer, but as it grew closer, the sound of the train's whistle echoed through the still air. Michael's heart skipped a beat, the fatigue that had settled over him now replaced by something else. A strange unease. He glanced around, but there were no other passengers approaching. Only the old man who hadn't moved. The train finally appeared, its lights blinding as it rumbled to a slow, groaning stop in front of him. The wheels squeaked as it came to rest, the doors opening with a soft hiss. A blast of warm air and the faint smell of oil greeted Michael as he stepped forward, his boots clanking on the platform as he moved toward the nearest door. The train wasn't what he expected. It wasn't the shiny, modern commuter train that should have been running on this line. No, this one looked older, much older. The metal body was worn, with patches of rust creeping along the sides. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the paint was chipped and faded. The entire train had a tired, forgotten air about it, as though it had been running for decades, without anyone caring to maintain it. The doors slid open with a creak, and Michael stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with old-fashioned lights hanging from the ceiling. The seats were upholstered in faded, mustard yellow fabric, and the smell of something musty and stale lingered in the air. Michael looked down the long aisle, the train seemingly stretching endlessly in front of him. There were only a handful of passengers, none of whom seemed to notice him as he boarded. He took a seat by the window, close to the middle of the car, and looked out at the empty platform. The station was already out of sight as the train began to move with a jolt, its wheels scraping against the tracks in a way that seemed wrong. The train was old, but it should have been smoother, shouldn't it? Michael closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a deep breath as the weight of his day settled back on his shoulders. He'd sleep the whole way home, he decided. A few hours of peace and quiet before the grind started again in the morning. But something was wrong. The train felt wrong. The low hum of the train's engine seemed to reverberate unnaturally in his chest, like a heartbeat pulsing through the air. Michael opened his eyes and looked at the car again. Passengers hadn't moved since he entered. They all sat perfectly still. No one was reading, no one was talking, and no one was sleeping. It was as though they were waiting, all of them, waiting for something. He turned his gaze toward the conductor's booth, but the door was closed. There was no sign of the conductor, not even a shadow through the frosted glass. Michael frowned and glanced back toward the front of the train, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that might explain the discomfort gnawing at him. The train lurched again, this time with more force. Michael gripped the armrest, his stomach flipping uneasily. The movement was erratic, unsteady, too unpredictable for a train of this type. He glanced at his watch again, but it seemed to be running slower than it should have been. 12:10 a.m. The train had been moving for far longer than it should have. He stood up and moved toward the nearest car door, intending to check the schedule. The next stop was supposed to be just 10 minutes away, but the train was moving slower and the landscape outside was an odd blur. But before he could reach the door, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He reached for the light switch above him, but it was unresponsive. He heard the faint rustle of movement from the other passengers, but none of. A soft, almost imperceptible creaking came from behind him. Michael's spine straightened. He turned toward the sound, but saw only the rows of empty seats behind him. The old man who had been sitting across the aisle from him had vanished. Michael's mouth went dry. He hadn't seen the man get up, hadn't seen him leave. But he was gone. The sudden movement from the corner of his vision caught his attention. He spun around just in time to see the elderly woman in the seat across from him. She had risen from her seat, moving stiffly like a marionette, her body jerking unnaturally with each step. Her eyes were locked onto him, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. Michael's pulse raced as he took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" he said, his voice shaking. The woman didn't respond, but continued to shuffle toward him with that same jerky, disjointed movement. He backed away, his feet stumbling against the floor as the train swayed with each curve in the tracks. "Please," Michael breathed, his voice strained with fear, but the woman didn't stop. Suddenly, a shrill scream shattered the stillness. Michael's blood turned to ice as the scream echoed down the length of the train, louder than anything he had ever heard. It wasn't human. It was guttural and wrong, a noise that seemed to crawl from somewhere deep inside the earth itself. The woman stopped moving, her body now frozen in place. The silence returned, thicker than before. Michael's breathing was shallow as he turned toward the front of the train, his eyes darting to each car door. The train had slowed considerably, almost to a crawl, but the windows still reflected only the twisted, dark trees that had replaced the familiar scenery. He glanced at his watch, but it had stopped working. The hands frozen at 12:14. Another scream erupted, this one much closer, so close it felt like it was inside the car with him. He whipped his head around, but the car was empty. Michael's chest tightened. He couldn't stay in here any longer. He had to get off. Whatever this train was, wherever it was taking him, it wasn't a place he wanted to be. The door at the front of the car remained shut, locked. There was no escape. He heard something else then, something faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging steps, as if something was moving through the darkened space of the train, getting closer. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his legs felt like lead as he slowly moved down the aisle, heart pounding louder than the train's wheels against the track. The footsteps were unmistakable now, growing louder with every step. He turned the corner, moving quickly toward the next car, but just as he reached the door, a cold, clammy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Michael froze. He turned slowly, the sensation of that grip like ice on his skin. He didn't want to look, but he had to. He had to know. When he turned around, he was face to face with the man he'd seen earlier, the elderly man who had been sitting across the aisle. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth hung open, but the man didn't say a word. Michael recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the old man didn't let go. Instead, he stepped closer, forcing Michael backward with the unnatural strength of a thing that should not be. "What is this?" Michael managed to say, his voice trembling with fear. "Where is this train going?" The old man's eyes glazed over, and his mouth twitched as if trying to form words, but no sound came. His lips curled into a hollow grin, and Michael's stomach lurched at the sight. Before Michael could react, the man released his grip and stepped aside, as if inviting him to look down the aisle. The train had stopped moving. In front of him, where there should have been more cars, there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of darkness beyond the door. No tracks, no station, just nothingness. The old man stepped forward once again, but this time his feet didn't make a sound as he glided past Michael, moving toward the empty space beyond the door. Michael stared at him, horrified, as the man disappeared into the black void. The door slammed shut behind him with a metallic clang. The train was still, but the atmosphere was thick with the sound of something distant. The groaning of metal against metal. The low, hollow whisper of something unnatural lurking beneath the surface. Michael could no longer deny it. The train was alive, and it was not taking him home. The last train wasn't going anywhere he recognized. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Michael stood frozen in place, his hands shaking by his sides. His heart raced, each beat thumping painfully in his chest. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. The sudden sense of isolation was almost unbearable, and for a moment, all he could hear was the ringing in his ears, louder than the train's soft groaning. The doors were locked. The windows reflected only blackness, and the muffled sound of distant, phantom footsteps echoed through the hallways. There was no sign of life left on the train. The other passengers had disappeared. Even the conductor, who had been absent for what seemed like hours now, was nowhere to be seen. He glanced down the aisle once more, his instincts screaming at him to get off, to leave this place, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to run. The air had changed too. It felt colder, thicker somehow, and every breath he took felt heavier than the last. The oppressive weight of something unseen pressed in on him, and he had the distinct feeling that the train had stopped moving altogether, suspended in some place between the world he knew and whatever realm this place belonged to. He turned his attention back to the front of the train, his eyes scanning for any sign of escape, but his focus was broken by a strange, soft tapping sound coming from behind him. At first, he tried to dismiss it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone or something was slowly walking toward him. Slowly, he pivoted around. A shape loomed in the darkness at the far end of the car. It was tall, towering even, casting an elongated shadow across the walls. It moved with an unnerving grace, its movements too fluid to be human, its outline blurring at the edges like a fading memory. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The figure took another step forward, and Michael instinctively took a step back, his foot hitting the edge of the train seat behind him. He stumbled, caught off balance, but he didn't take his eyes off the figure. It was familiar. No, that wasn't quite right. It felt familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp, something buried deep in his mind that refused to come into focus. The more he stared at it, the more it seemed to change, shifting, stretching, growing, its face becoming a blur of twisted shadows. Who? Michael's voice faltered, his throat dry. What are you? The figure did not respond, but it tilted its head slightly, as though studying him. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical in its precision. And then it stepped forward again. The hairs on the back of Michael's neck stood on end. He knew instinctively that this was not a person, not in any sense he could understand. It was something else, something old, something dark. It felt like a presence from the very depths of the earth, something that had been waiting for him. He took another step back, but his body froze when he realized the figure was no longer moving toward him. It had stopped in place, its head now tilted sharply, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move. Then the figure raised its arm. The motion was slow, but fluid, its hand reaching toward Michael. Each finger elongated unnaturally, twitching like the tendrils of some ancient, dark force. The air seemed to thicken around Michael's chest as he stood there, his mind racing for something to do, but his limbs refused to obey. The train had become a tomb, and he was the last living thing inside it. "Please," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were fragile, breaking apart as he spoke them. "I don't want to die." The figure tilted its head even further. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, remained hidden in shadow, but Michael could feel the weight of its gaze. The feeling was suffocating, as though it had peered straight into his very soul. The train lurched suddenly, as if jolted awake. The lights flickered and buzzed before going out again, plunging the car into total darkness. Michael's heart slammed against his ribcage, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse under the pressure of it all. But before he could even move, a sound, sharp and grating, scraped through the silence. A voice. It was deep, graveled. It vibrated through the train like a low hum. "You should never have gotten on this train." The voice felt like a physical presence, pressing against his skin, wrapping around him like a vice. He tried to speak, to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Another jolt, and this time, the train lurched forward with such force that Michael stumbled, barely catching himself on the nearest seat. He looked out the window. Nothing. No trees. No track. No station. The outside was completely dark, but there was something beyond the glass. The sensation of eyes in the dark, staring at him, watching him. He could almost feel them press against him, like 1,000 unseen bodies crowding around the train. The figure was still there, though Michael could no longer see it clearly in the dark. But the presence was unmistakable. It had grown larger, looming in his mind, and his instincts screamed for him to run. But there was nowhere to run. Michael fell into one of the empty seats, trying to steady himself as the train's movement became erratic, jerking back and forth. The once smooth ride had become a nightmare of twists and turns. The train was no longer following tracks, no longer confined to a linear path. It was moving through something, somewhere, that was entirely beyond his understanding. He was trapped. Just as his pulse quickened in panic, the lights flickered again, briefly illuminating the car. For a split second, he thought he saw something in the distance, another figure standing at the front of the car. But this one wasn't like the others. This one was familiar. It was his reflection. Michael's eyes widened. He hadn't moved from the seat, but there he was, standing at the far end of the train in front of the door. His doppelganger, his exact mirror image, stood motionless, facing him. The train jolted again, harder this time, and as the lights came back on, the figure was gone. But the sensation remained. Something was wrong, and Michael could no longer tell what was real. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as the train continued to shudder, its mechanical groaning growing louder with every passing second. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to calm his breathing, but his thoughts swirled in disarray. The reflection. It wasn't just a hallucination, was it? It had been him, staring at him from the front of the car. Yet he hadn't moved. The feeling of something being terribly wrong had only deepened, creeping into his bones with each passing moment. There was no rational explanation for the things he was experiencing. No explanation for the twisted shadows in the dark, for the unsettling passengers, or for the eerie voice that had echoed through the train like a warning. He gripped the armrest of the seat as the train lurched again, this time more violently, as though it was fighting against its own course. The lights flickered, casting everything in a stuttering, intermittent glow. The car seemed to stretch and bend with the motion of the train, the walls warping around him, and the air felt thick, as though the oxygen itself was being drained from the space. He couldn't sit still any longer. He had to do something. Michael stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He staggered toward the end of the car, towards the door where he had seen his reflection moments ago. But when he reached it, there was no reflection, no familiar face staring back at him. Instead, the glass was dark, impossibly black. He leaned closer, peering into it, desperate to catch a glimpse of the outside world. But there was nothing. Nothing. The train wasn't moving forward anymore. It was suspended in darkness, adrift, as if there was no world beyond its metal walls. Michael slammed his fist against the door in frustration, a desperate cry escaping his throat. He reached for the handle again, but this time it opened with an eerie, almost musical creak. It should have been locked. It should have been. Yet, as the door swung open, a draft of cold air rushed into the cabin, chilling him to the bone. And then he heard the voice again. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" The voice was faint, far off, but unmistakably familiar. It wasn't the same gravelly tone that had spoken earlier. No, this voice was softer, almost comforting. Yet it carried an edge, an undertone of something ancient and knowing. Michael's heart raced, and his stomach twisted into knots. He didn't want to hear more, didn't want to confront whatever this was, but his legs moved, pulling him forward, despite the fight within him. The door led to the next car, but when he stepped through, he froze. There, standing in the middle of the next cabin, was his reflection again. But this time, it wasn't just an image in the glass. This time, the reflection was alive, moving as he did. It stood facing him, mirroring his every movement. And the worst part, his reflection was smiling. Not just any smile. A wide, unnerving grin that stretched too far, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. Michael's breath caught in his throat, and he took a cautious step back, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refused to obey. "Who are you?" Michael whispered, his voice barely a breath. The figure didn't speak, but it tilted its head in that same way the creature had before. A slow, deliberate movement that sent chills racing down his spine. It was as if it were studying him, savoring his fear. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of a seat, and he fell to the floor with a harsh thud. The reflection's grin widened. "You're trapped," the voice said again, softer now, like it was speaking directly into his mind. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not for anyone on this train. The journey's already begun." Michael's pulse spiked. His thoughts scrambled. He had to escape. This thing, this reflection, whatever it wasn't him. It couldn't be. It was something darker, something twisted that was wearing his face, manipulating him. Panic surged in his chest, and he scrambled to his feet, racing toward the next car. He had to get to the front of the train. Maybe there was a conductor. Maybe there was someone who could explain what was happening. He yanked on the door handle to the next car, but it didn't budge. Locked. The train continued to rock, and the lights above flickered, dimming for just a moment, before casting an eerie, sickly glow. Michael stumbled back, heart hammering, breath ragged. And then, as if summoned by his fear, the reflection appeared behind him, its footsteps echoing through the silent cabin. "You should have known, Michael," the reflection said, its voice too soft, too calm. "There's no way out of this place. You've already lost." Michael spun around, but before he could take a breath, the reflection was gone, vanished into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The cold air hit him again. He turned toward the open door behind him. For a split second, he saw a shadow move quickly across the edge of his vision. And then, the reflection reappeared in front of him, standing right there, impossibly close, its grin widening even further. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, but the reflection did not move. It stood there still, waiting. Suddenly, the train lurched once again, this time with a force that knocked Michael to the floor. The reflection, too, stumbled, its features flickering. It seemed to glitch, warping, its smile morphing into something grotesque, something monstrous. "It's too late," the voice whispered again. This time it wasn't just in his mind. It was real. It was coming from everywhere at once. "You were never meant to get off. The train isn't stopping for you. Michael pushed himself to his feet, hands trembling. He could feel someone pushing against him from all sides. The train felt like it was closing in on him, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering. The temperature dropped, his breath visible in the icy air. His reflection laughed, a low, guttural laugh that reverberated through the cabin. And that's when he realized. It wasn't just the reflection that had been following him. It was everything. The train, the passengers, the voices. All of it was part of a nightmare, a web he couldn't escape. He had no way out. The train was never going to stop. It had already claimed him. Michael's mind was spinning. The laughter from the reflection echoed in his ears, bouncing off the walls of the claustrophobic train car like 1,000 whispers. He tried to steady himself, breathing shallowly as the cold air surrounded him. But every attempt to make sense of what was happening only made it worse. The train had become something else, something impossible. It wasn't just a ride, it was a prison. He could feel it in his bones, the oppressive weight of the invisible forces pressing against him. It wasn't real, but it was, and he didn't know how to escape the paradox. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. He looked around, desperate for an answer, but the world outside the train was still nothing but pitch black void. There were no stars, no road signs, no glimpse of civilization. Just a never-ending abyss. The reflection, his reflection, was still there, its grin stretching wider, impossibly wide. The glass seemed to ripple around it, like the surface of a lake disturbed by an unseen hand. Michael reached out in panic, only to feel his fingers brush against something cold and slick, like the surface of the door was a mirror now. His reflection reached toward him, mimicking his movements exactly, its fingers pressing against the glass where his own hand met the door. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. The reflection's hand didn't stop at the glass. It pressed through it, as though the laws of physics had no hold on this place. The train jolted violently once again, and Michael was thrown off balance. He crashed into the seat beside him, his body aching, his heart racing in his chest. But when he looked up, his reflection was standing directly in front of him, inside the cabin. It was no longer behind glass, it was here, in the flesh. A chill ran through him. The reflection's grin widened further, but now it wasn't just a smile. The face twisted, shifting in a way that defied nature. The features distorted, as if the very face was being stretched, torn apart by invisible hands. Its eyes, once black, were now swirling pools of darkness, swallowing the light around them. Michael opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. His throat was dry, his body frozen in place. The thing that wore his face took a step forward, its feet dragging across the floor with a low scraping sound that made Michael's skin crawl. "You're not you," it said, its voice low and almost purring, distorted like a broken record. "Not anymore. You never were." The word slammed into Michael's chest like a punch. He staggered backward, his mind a blur of panic and confusion. This thing, this reflection, was more than just an imitation. It was an abomination. It was a mockery of everything he thought he knew about himself. "I'm not you," Michael gasped, the words coming out in a strangled breath. "I'm not like you." The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that rumbled through the train car. "Of course you are. You've always been. And now, you will become part of this place. Like all the others." Michael's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he backed into the corner of the train. He had to get away, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure stepped closer, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. This is where it ends. This is the final stop. You never wanted to know the truth, but now you will. The air around him grew colder still, the walls of the train closing in, tightening like the grip of a hand. Michael's breath was coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. The lights flickered one last time, plunging the car into darkness for a fraction of a second. When the light returned, the train was no longer the same. The seats were gone. The floor was cracked and warped, as though the train itself had aged centuries in a matter of moments. The windows were shattered, the dark night beyond now replaced by a scene of desolate emptiness, a barren wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. And there, at the far end of the car, was the figure once more. "Welcome to the inn, Michael," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of distorted echoes. "There's no escape. Not anymore." Michael's chest constricted. He felt the weight of the train, the weight of this reality pressing down on him. He was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He thought of the world he had come from, the one where trains had stops, where passengers disembarked and went on with their lives. But that world was gone. It had been taken from him the moment he boarded this infernal train. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with terror as the truth finally settled in. There was no escape. The train was never going to stop. The reflection stepped forward again, and this time it was too close. Its grin was the last thing Michael saw before it reached out, its cold fingers brushing against his face, pulling him into its embrace. And then everything went dark. The train continued its journey through the void, its wheels grinding against tracks that no one could see, its whistle echoing in the empty night. The lights flickered in the darkness, casting brief, fleeting glimpses of a world that no longer existed. The passengers had all disappeared, replaced by their reflections, twisted and contorted into something else entirely. And as the train hurtled forward into eternity, it carried with it the souls of those who had once thought they could escape. And somewhere, far in the distance, the final stop waited. Forever. The story of the last train home seems to have reached its chilling and eerie conclusion with Michael's fate sealed aboard the never-ending journey. However, if you would like a deeper exploration of the train's mystery or an aftermath with lingering consequences, here's a possible continuation that could expand the narrative further. It could serve to set up more mystery or perhaps begin to uncover deeper layers of the train's reality. The train never stopped. It never even slowed down. The tracks stretched on, infinitely long, as though the world had unraveled in some unimaginable way. And yet, the air still hummed with an eerie quiet, a hum that somehow felt both comforting and suffocating. Hours, or perhaps days, had passed since Michael had vanished into the embrace of his twisted reflection. No one aboard the train seemed to acknowledge the disappearance, or perhaps they couldn't. They were like him, lost, trapped in their own world of mirrors and nightmares, waiting for something they couldn't explain. And yet, the world outside continued to pull at the edges of reality. There was a faint knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was enough to break through the silence that had enveloped the train for so long. A hesitant knock, followed by another. A cold draft wafted through the cabin, and the air suddenly felt thinner, sharper. The light overhead flickered. For a moment, the train seemed to stop. The rhythmic sound of its motion ceased, and everything felt suspended in time. The door opened. A man stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the threshold. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and worn, like someone who had been wandering for far too long. His eyes were wide, frantic, like someone who had just awoken from a nightmare. Where am I? The man gasped, his voice hoarse and uncertain. He stepped forward, taking a cautious glance around. The cabin was empty. The train car, once full of people, was now abandoned, just a hollow shell. His eyes flicked to the shattered windows and the unnatural darkness beyond. He seemed to take a step back, but then froze, realizing something. He wasn't alone. At the far end of the car, another figure stood. The shadow of someone, or something, was silhouetted against the darkened windows. It was tall, too tall, its features obscured, but its presence unmistakable. "Who are you?" the man whispered. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, its outline shifting slightly, as though it were made of the shadows themselves. And then the voice spoke, Not aloud, but inside his head, a voice that was both familiar and alien, cold and knowing. Another lost soul, the voice said, its tone a mixture of mockery and sympathy. Another traveler on the endless journey. The man's heart raced. He staggered back, his breath quickening as panic set in. I don't belong here. I'm not. The figure stepped forward, its silhouette bending unnaturally as it came closer, its presence pressing down on the man. He felt his legs weaken, his chest tightening. You belong with us now, the figure said softly. The train has no end. You will ride it forever, just like all the others. You'll never get off. You'll never reach your destination. You'll never see home again. The man screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure smiled, a twisted, elongated grin that stretched too wide, too far. The grin was not the reflections, but it carried the same unsettling promise of an eternity in limbo. In the front car, the one closest to the engineer's booth, the shadowy figures of the passengers moved silently. They too were waiting for something, though what exactly, they weren't sure. The train had no need to stop. It carried its burdens silently, relentlessly, through the dark. And then, the train jolted once more, a brief spark of light filling the cabin before plunging it back into the abyss. It passed through the tunnels of time, loops and spirals that were no longer constrained by the physical world. Through the darkness, another figure appeared. A woman, her face pale, her eyes haunted. She stared out of the window, seeing not the empty night, but the images that had been left behind. Shadows, shapes, figures of people who had disappeared, faces that stared back at her from the depths of memory. Her name was Emily. Emily had been on the train once before. She had known its horrors, had felt the dread it instilled in her bones. But she had escaped, or so she had thought. Now, as the train rumbled beneath her feet, she knew the truth. She had never truly left. She had simply been waiting for the inevitable return. For the day when the train would come back to collect her. And she wasn't alone. The train hummed steadily as it traveled through the eternal night, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the tracks. Emily's heart raced in her chest, a mixture of dread and familiarity consuming her. She had been here before in this place on this cursed train, yet the weight of her memories felt heavier now, as though she had forgotten something important, something she could never quite grasp. Her fingers tightened around the cold metal of the seat in front of her, as if anchoring herself to something solid in this shifting nightmare. The car was empty, save for the occasional flicker of dim light above and the sounds of the train moving through the black void outside. There were no windows on this train that showed the world as it was. The outside was a blur, a vast, endless darkness with no stars, no moon. Just an empty abyss. She had hoped to escape. Emily had lived through the terror of the train once, fought her way out, found a way back to the real world. But now it felt as though that world had abandoned her. There was no way to know for sure, but she could sense the train was pulling her back into its terrible orbit. The air felt heavy, thick, and when she breathed in, it felt wrong, almost suffocating. And then she saw it again. The same reflection, not in a mirror this time, but in the window beside her. A glimpse of her own face, her tired eyes, her worn-out features, morphing into something unrecognizable. Emily whispered to herself. Her voice cracked as the words left her throat. A small noise echoed from the back of the train, a faint tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. She turned slowly, a deep unease creeping through her body. The dim lighting barely illuminated the other side of the cabin, but as she squinted into the darkness, something stirred in the distance. The shadow of a figure appeared, moving slowly toward her. Tall, gaunt, its form twisted and shifting with unnatural fluidity. At first, Emily's mind couldn't process what she was seeing. It looked like a person, but not quite. The silhouette was elongated, distorted, and as it stepped closer, she could feel a chill running up her spine. It was him, Michael. He was here, The man she had left behind, the one whose reflection had once haunted the train. His eyes were wide, vacant, and his face was almost unrecognizable, like something had eaten away at it. His skin was pale, stretched taut, as if something inside him was pushing against the surface, desperate to break free. "Michael," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She took a step forward, hesitant, unsure if what she was seeing was even real. He didn't respond, but his head tilted slightly to one side, the movements jerky, unnatural. The longer she stared at him, the more she realized that this was not Michael, not anymore. Whatever had taken hold of him had stripped him of everything he had been. He was just another passenger now, another soul condemned to the train's endless ride. "You didn't leave." Michael's voice came through as a low rasp, each word distorted as if something was fighting to get out. "You can't leave. None of us can." Emily took a step back, her pulse quickening. "You're wrong," she said firmly, though doubt gnawed at her gut. "I left once. I found my way out. I can do it again." His twisted grin returned, just like the one she had seen in the reflection. His hands, cold and clammy, rose toward her, long fingers curling into claws. "No, you're part of it now. You're trapped, like all of us." The words hung in the air, a weight that suffocated her. Emily backed up, her hands instinctively reaching for the door. But it wasn't a door anymore. It was a wall, cold and unyielding. Suddenly, the train's lights flickered. The rhythmic hum of the tracks intensified, and the temperature dropped, sending a shiver through her spine. The train sped up, faster and faster, as if rushing toward something. "I won't be trapped again," Emily whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the rising panic. She pushed through the sudden surge of terror, focusing all her energy on getting to the front of the train, where she had last seen the conductor. She had to find a way out again. The figure of Michael, if it could still be called that, moved toward her in jerky steps, its eyes burning with an unholy intensity. "There is no conductor. There's no way out. We are the train now." Emily's blood ran cold as the full weight of the statement hit her. She knew it was true. The train was alive. It was something beyond human understanding. And once you boarded, you didn't leave. Not without paying the price. The lights flickered again, and this time when they came back on, the train had changed. The cabin was no longer what it had been. It was a twisted mockery of a train, the walls cracked and warped as if the structure itself was decomposing. The seats were no longer normal. They were broken, stained, and covered in a thick layer of dust. Emily stumbled forward, trying to keep her bearings as she moved toward the front of the train, where the engine should have been. But it was gone. In its place was a black, hollow void, an endless chasm that seemed to pull at her very soul. She turned to look back. Michael, if that was still Michael, was standing right behind her, smiling that wide, twisted grin. His eyes were empty, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, suffocating her from the inside out. "It's time to stop running," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You'll stay here with me. Forever." The words hit her like a punch, and she realized with a cold certainty that she wasn't going to get out this time. The train wasn't just a place, it was a part of her now. And it was dragging her deeper into the abyss, where the past, present, and future were all one. There was no escape. There never had been. The final stop had come. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned back toward the hollow void where the engine once stood. It stretched infinitely, dark and suffocating, as though the train itself had absorbed the very essence of the world. Her hands trembled, but she refused to give in to the terror clawing at her insides. She had to fight. She had to find a way to escape. But Michael's words, those hollow words, echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. "You'll stay here with me. Forever." Her hands reached instinctively to the walls of the train car, her fingers brushing against the cracked and distorted surface. The walls pulsed, warm and alive, as though the train was aware of her presence, aware of her fear. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, The wall in front of her cracked wide open, revealing an all-encompassing darkness beyond. The train's pulse quickened again, vibrating beneath her feet, a rhythmic pounding that resonated in her chest. "Where are we?" Emily whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her heart raced as she backed away from the opening, her eyes still locked on Michael. No, not Michael, the shadow of what he had become. He stepped forward, his body bending unnaturally with each movement, a grotesque parody of human motion. His grin never wavered, and his eyes, once human, now reflected nothing but hollow, unblinking voids. "Where else would we be?" he asked, his voice now a whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "We are here, together, forever." Emily turned, looking down the length of the train, her pulse pounding in her ears. The once familiar passengers had all vanished. The seats were empty, the car silent, as if the train itself was waiting for something, waiting for her to accept it, to give in. But she refused. She clenched her fists, pushing back the urge to collapse in fear. She was stronger than this. She had been through the worst already. She had fought her way out before, and she would fight her way out again. She turned toward the broken wall, focusing on the strange emptiness beyond it. Was this a portal? A door to another world? Was there something on the other side that could help her escape? A distant sound reached her ears, a shrill, high-pitched screech. It was coming from the darkness, from the void beyond the train. The noise sent a sharp chill up her spine. She wanted to run, to escape, but the darkness pulled her in, and her legs refused to move. Then, suddenly, a shadow crossed the void. Something huge. A monstrous figure loomed out of the blackness. Its eyes glowed an unnatural green, piercing through the darkness like twin lanterns. Its body was massive, twisted, and distorted in a way that defied all logic. Its arms were too long, its fingers too sharp. It crawled forward, its massive form scraping against the edges of the train. The beast, the one that had haunted her dreams, the one that had followed her since she first boarded the cursed train. It was here, and it was angry. "Run," Emily whispered to herself, but the words were swallowed by the train's relentless hum. She turned, her heart pounding as she made her way down the narrow aisle. The train began to rumble, shaking violently beneath her feet as the beast moved closer, its shadow enveloping her in darkness. "Why run?" Michael's voice echoed behind her. "It's all the same. You'll never get away." She ignored him, pushing forward, trying to outrun the mounting terror in her chest. The train shook harder, and she stumbled, falling to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, desperate, but something grabbed her ankle. A cold, clammy hand, no, not a hand. A claw. The nails dug into her flesh, pulling her back toward the looming darkness. The beast's glowing eyes were now inches from her, its gaping mouth opening, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Its breath was hot and rancid, and as it inhaled, the very air around her seemed to warp, as if reality itself was bending. Emily kicked, struggling, but the creature's grip tightened, and she was dragged backward, her mind racing. But just as the beast opened its mouth to consume her, the lights of the train flickered once again, plunging the car into complete darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, the sound of something breaking. A burst of light flashed through the cabin. The train jolted, the walls warping and distorting around Emily. In that moment of chaos, Emily saw it, a crack in the air itself, a tear in the fabric of reality. She reached out toward it, her fingers brushing against the rift. She felt the air shift, a magnetic pull drawing her toward the crack. She didn't know what it was or where it would lead, but in that instant, she knew it was her only chance. Without hesitation, she lunged toward it, her body flinging through the crack just as the beast roared, its claws swiping at the empty space where she had been. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the rift closed. The dark void was gone. Emily collapsed onto cold, solid ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She opened her eyes and blinked, trying to focus, but the world around her seemed disorienting, as though she had passed through something unnatural. She was no longer on the train. The train was gone. She stood shakily, looking around. The place she had landed in was unfamiliar, dark, but familiar in a strange, eerie way. She felt as though she had been here before. The sky above her was a sickly shade of purple, swirling with unnatural clouds. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless, oppressive void stretching far beyond the horizon. And then she saw it, a silhouette in the distance. Something was waiting for her. The figure approached slowly, its form hazy at first, but as it grew closer, Emily's heart began to pound in her chest. The face that appeared in front of her was not Michael's. It was something different, something darker, something with knowledge of the train, of the cycle that had bound her to it. "You've arrived," it whispered, its voice echoing in Emily's mind. The last stop. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the figure that loomed before her. It was tall and imposing, but its features were difficult to make out, as if it were made of shadows, its form constantly shifting and melting into the darkness around it. The air around it crackled with a strange energy, and for a brief moment, Emily wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by fleeing the train. The figure took another step closer, and its face finally became clear, though it was not a face Emily recognized. It wasn't human. The eyes were deep, dark pits, and the mouth that stretched into a twisted smile seemed too wide, too knowing. "You've made it this far," the figure said, its voice an echo in the empty space, as though it were coming from all directions at once. "But do you understand?" Emily stepped back, her throat dry. The air was thick, suffocating, and the more she breathed in, the more her thoughts began to cloud. She had escaped the train, but something told her that this new place, this strange realm, might be worse. "What is this place?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure's smile deepened, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim, purple light. "It is where the lost go," it answered, the words sent through her like an electric shock. "Where the ones who can never leave the train are kept. This is where they linger, trapped forever in the space between worlds." Emily felt a chill run through her. "I'm not trapped. I made it out. The train is gone." The figure laughed softly, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. "The train never truly leaves. It shifts, moving between places, between worlds. And those who ride it become a part of it, whether they want to or not." Emily's mind reeled. She was still trying to grasp the idea that the train was more than just a nightmarish transportation system. It was something alive, something that moved through realities. And now, she was stuck here, in a place that seemed to exist between them all. "What do you want from me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. The figure tilted its head, eyes gleaming. "I don't want anything from you, Emily," it said, its voice drawing closer, more intimate. "But you will understand soon enough. You're not the first to wander here, and you won't be the last." Emily's stomach twisted. There was something unsettling about the figure's words, something too familiar. She had the sudden, horrifying feeling that she wasn't going to like what it was about to say. "The train is a loop," the figure continued, "a cycle, and it is one you can never break. Not fully. You may have escaped its physical form, but its essence is now inside you. You carry it with you, and as long as you exist, it will find you again, bringing you back to its rails, its corridors, its endless journey." The words pierced through her like shards of ice. She wanted to deny it, to shout back that she was free, that she had escaped. But deep down, she knew, she had always known, that it wasn't that simple. The train had never truly let her go. "No," Emily whispered, her knees feeling weak. "No, I won't go back." The figure's smile widened, and it took another step forward. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to shudder, as if the place itself was alive, reacting to her fear. "You can fight it," the figure murmured. "You can run, but there will always be a moment when the train comes for you, a moment when the last stop arrives, and you'll be called back. You'll hear its whistle in the dark, feel its pull in your bones, and you will have no choice but to board again." "I won't," Emily said firmly, though her voice faltered. She could feel the coldness of the figure seeping into her soul, pushing her toward despair. But she couldn't give in. She wouldn't. "You don't have to understand yet," the figure said softly, as if it were speaking to a child. "In time you will. This place is the waiting room, the threshold. And once you enter it, there is no true escape." The air grew colder still, the purple haze thickening around her. Emily wanted to run, to flee from the figure's voice and its presence, but she found herself frozen in place, her body refusing to obey her commands. It was as if the very air around her was pressing in, binding her to this place. The figure raised one long, shadowy hand and pointed toward the horizon, toward a faint light flickering in the distance. "There's a way forward, Emily," it said. "A path to something that might bring you peace, or at least delay the inevitable. But you must choose. The journey is yours to make." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. A path? A way forward? Was it an illusion, like everything else here? Was it real? Could it lead her to true escape from rain and the endless cycle? "Go," the figure whispered, its voice fading into the growing darkness. "It's your only choice now." The light in the distance beckoned, like a star on the edge of a void. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, and it was moving, just as the train had once moved, pulling her forward into the unknown. Emily took a deep breath. She didn't know what the light was or what lay beyond it, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going back to the train. Not now, not ever again. And so, with every ounce of strength she could muster, Emily began to walk toward the light, toward whatever lay beyond. She had no idea what would come next, but she would face it, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of the unknown. The train might never fully let go of her, but she wasn't going to stop fighting. She was going to find a way out, a real way out, even if it meant battling the darkness inside and around her. For now, that was all she could do. Emily's footsteps were the only sound in the stillness, each step taken with hesitant resolve. The light ahead remained faint but undeniable, flickering like a far-off beacon. She couldn't explain it, but the warmth it offered seemed to draw her forward, the only promise of solace after the horrors of the train. As she walked, the sensation of being watched never left her. The darkness around her swirled, and she could almost feel the figure's presence lurking just beyond her reach. Despite her resolve, every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run from this place and never look back. But the light called to her, and she couldn't ignore it. Her thoughts drifted back to the figure's words, the promise of peace, the warning of inevitability. It didn't matter. Emily clenched her fists and quickened her pace. She couldn't afford to stop. She wouldn't let the train, or whatever had cursed her to this nightmare, win. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly with each step, as if the very earth was alive, adjusting to her movements. Every now and then, she would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the thickening fog and the undulating darkness that wrapped itself tighter around the edges of her vision. Then something shifted in the air. The light ahead began to grow, slowly but surely, its warmth growing more pronounced. It no longer flickered, but now burned steady, cutting through the darkness in a way that felt almost tangible. As she drew closer, Emily could see that it wasn't a traditional light source. There were no visible bulbs or flames. It was simply there. It felt alive, beckoning her like a guardian angel, or perhaps a siren calling her into the depths of the sea. Her pace quickened once more, her breath coming in quick gasps as the light now radiated so brightly she could barely see anything else. And then, just as the light enveloped her, Everything went quiet. The world around her shifted. The strange sensation of weightlessness overcame her, and Emily felt as if she were floating, suspended between realities. The darkness that had pursued her for so long faded into nothingness, leaving only the glowing orb of light that now consumed her every sense. The eerie, oppressive feeling of the figure's presence was gone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily found herself alone. At least she thought she was. She took a step forward, her feet meeting solid ground once again, but it wasn't the same ground she had walked before. The earth was smooth beneath her, polished, like a surface she had never touched. The air was crisp, clean, and alive with a vibrancy that sent a shiver down her spine. The fog was gone, and all around her were rolling hills bathed in the soft glow of the light she had followed. A sense of calm washed over her, soothing the tension in her muscles, the nagging anxiety that had plagued her since the moment she first boarded the cursed train. For a brief, fleeting moment, Emily allowed herself to believe that she had truly found peace. But the feeling was short-lived. As she took another step, she felt something pull at the edges of her consciousness, a faint whisper, soft but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she stopped, frozen in place. "You think it's over, don't you?" The voice murmured. Her breath hitched, and her heart skipped a beat. The voice. It was familiar, too familiar. The voice of the figure. Turning, Emily's gaze swept over the now-still landscape, but she saw nothing. No figure, no darkness, just the light. Yet the voice echoed in her mind, clear as day. "The light cannot save you, Emily." The words sent a jolt of dread through her. She looked down at her hands, trembling. "No," she whispered. "It's not real. This isn't real." The voice laughed softly, and Emily could feel it curling around her like smoke. "You can deny it all you want, but deep down, you know the truth. You're never truly free. You'll always be part of the train's journey, part of its endless cycle." Emily's pulse raced. Her legs were like lead beneath her as the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a faint rumble rising from somewhere deep below. She wanted to run, to escape, but the voice was everywhere now, filling the space, spinning around her until she couldn't tell where it was coming from. "I told you," the voice hissed. "The train will always find you. No matter how far you go, it will call you back." A sudden wave of nausea gripped her. She stumbled, her breath catching in her throat. The light flickered, flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its power. Emily looked at it in desperation, clutching her arms tightly to her chest. "No, please." The rumble grew louder, and before her eyes, the light began to warp, twisting and distorting. It was no longer a pure, warm glow, but something darker, something colder. The landscape around her seemed to ripple, fading into shadow once again, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling at the edges. And in the distance, she saw it. The train. At first, it was just a glint, a tiny speck in the distance. But as the seconds stretched, it grew, coming closer and closer, like a vast, dark serpent slithering through the fog. It was impossibly large, its silhouette stretching across the horizon. And then Emily heard it, the unmistakable sound of a train's whistle, low, guttural, calling to her. "No," she screamed, backing away from the approaching monster. But it was too late. The train's presence filled the air, overwhelming her senses, its dark silhouette swallowing everything around her. The light that had once held so much promise now flickered and died, consumed by the train's encroaching shadow. And with that final sound, the train's whistle deafening in her ears, Emily knew she had never truly escaped. The journey was never over. The train loomed before Emily, its dark form towering over her, endless cars stretching into the black void. The air around her thickened, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't look away, couldn't move, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The turn and flee as far as her legs would take her. The whistle sounded again, deafening in its power. It wasn't the sound of a normal train. It was something ancient, something primordial. It resonated deep within her bones, stirring a fear that wasn't entirely her own. It was as if the train called to her, beckoning her to return. She stumbled back, her feet refusing to move faster than a crawl. Every part of her body felt heavy, weighed down by the knowledge that she was trapped once more. "Why?" she whispered to no one, her voice barely audible. She felt the tears prick at her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't show weakness, not now. Why can't I be free? The answer came in the form of the voice again, cold and unrelenting. "Because it's never over, Emily." She whipped around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, wrapping around her like an inescapable web. "You thought you could escape," the voice mocked. "But the truth is, you were never meant to leave. The train finds those who are bound to it, and once you are marked, you are forever its passenger." Emily pressed her hands to her ears, but the words drilled through her skull like nails. They didn't stop. "You may have left the tracks, but the train is a part of you now. You can run, you can hide, but it will always come for you. And when it does, it will drag you back every single time." "No!" Emily cried, her voice shaking with frustration and fear. She fell to her knees, hands clutching the earth beneath her, grounding herself in a moment of defiance. She refused to believe this was her fate. She wouldn't let it be, but as she knelt there, she could feel the ground trembling beneath her, the vibrations increasing with each passing second. The train's whistle grew louder, almost deafening, and the air became so thick that it felt as though she was drowning in it. She looked up, and there it was, the train. It hadn't moved closer, but now, it was more than just a distant shadow. It was an inescapable presence in the world around her. The dark cars shimmered, stretching into infinity. The train was no longer just an object. It was an entity, a living thing. And it was hungry. The doors of the nearest car opened. She could see shadows moving within, though there was no one in sight. The train had come for her. No escape. Her heart pounded as she stood, her legs shaky, but she forced herself to take a step forward. She had no choice. The figure, the voice, the train itself, was waiting for her to make this choice, to make the inevitable decision. It was never going to let her go, not unless she took control. As her feet hit the tracks, the darkness around her seemed to ripple, the train's shadow wrapping around her like a hand, pulling her into its grip. She tried to pull back, tried to fight the force, but it was useless. It was like trying to escape the pull of gravity. With each step, the sound of the train grew louder, its whistle more deafening. And yet, deep in her chest, Emily felt something shifting, something different. She wasn't sure what it was, but she felt it. A sense of power, a sense of control that had been absent before. The train was pulling her in, but this time, she wasn't letting it. She had been afraid, yes, but now she understood. The train could not own her. It couldn't dictate her fate. And then, just like that, the world around her seemed to stop. The darkness fell away. The train was gone. Emily stood on the tracks, her breath ragged, her body trembling, but the ground beneath her feet felt solid. Real. She was back. She didn't know where this place was, but it was different from the strange, distorted world she had been trapped in. There was no light, no fog, and no rumbling train. There was just quiet. Emily didn't know if she was dreaming, or if she was alive, or if she had crossed over into some other reality. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going back. Not this time. As she turned away from the tracks, a sense of finality washed over her. The cycle that had once seemed unbreakable, it had ended. Or had it? Just as she began to walk away, she heard it again. The faintest sound. A whisper. "You can't outrun the train forever, Emily." Her heart froze. She didn't turn around. She knew. It was never truly over. The weight of it on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs, as if to remind her that the fight was far from over. She could still hear the faint, haunting whistle of the train in the back of her mind, like an echo from another world. She pressed on, moving through the unfamiliar landscape, but the world around her remained eerily still. There were no trees, no hills, no sign of life, just an endless, flat stretch of land that seemed to go on forever. The path she walked felt like it had no end, and every step she took seemed to carry her deeper into the unknown. Despite everything, Emily couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. It was subtle at first, a quiet rustle of the air, a shifting shadow in the corner of her eye. But the feeling grew, intensifying with each passing moment, as though the very landscape itself was holding its breath. Then suddenly she froze. A figure appeared before her, standing just beyond the path. It was barely more than a silhouette, tall, imposing, and entirely black against the faint glow of the horizon. She couldn't make out any details, just the shape of it, looming and vast. A sense of dread rushed over her as she stood motionless, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. "You've returned," the figure said, its voice low and raspy. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The voice. It was familiar, and yet it wasn't. It had the same tone as the one that had spoken to her on the train, cold, detached, but now laced with something darker, more ancient. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves, but it felt impossible. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure remained silent for a moment before speaking again, its voice carrying a strange weight. "I'm the one who has watched over the train, over all who have traveled its path. You are no different from the others, Emily. You were chosen, and now you must return." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and her knees almost buckled beneath her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. I won't. I escaped. I'm free." The figure seemed to laugh, a low, mocking sound that sent chills through her entire body. "Freedom? There is no freedom for those marked by the train, child. You have walked its path, and now you will walk it again." The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. "This world is only a pause, a brief respite. But the train will always come for you, no matter how far you run." Emily stepped back, her mind racing. She couldn't let this be true. She couldn't accept that the nightmare would repeat forever. She had fought so hard to break free. She had to find a way to stop it. But the figure's words settled deep within her. There is no freedom for those marked by the train. It was the truth, and she hated it. "What do you want from me?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "What do you want me to do?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering her question. "You already know the answer." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she looked down, her heart pounding. Slowly, as though pulled by an invisible force, she found herself stepping forward toward the figure. She tried to resist, tried to turn away, but something held her in place, something stronger than her own will. "The train needs its passengers," the figure intoned, its voice like ice. "And you are one of them." Emily's vision blurred as her thoughts swirled. No, I won't go back." But the force pulling her forward grew stronger. The figure reached out, its hand outstretched, and in that moment, Emily understood what she had to do. The choice had never been hers. She had been chosen the moment she had stepped onto that cursed train. With a final scream of defiance, Emily wrenched herself free from the pull, staggering backward. Her heart raced, her breath came in ragged gasps, and the world around her began to warp, the landscape twisting like a reflection in shattered glass. The train's whistle rang out, clear and sharp. And then, without warning, the train appeared. Not as a distant shadow this time, but as a monstrous, gaping maw, its immense form blocking the horizon. The carriages stretched far beyond the horizon, endless and dark, each one waiting to claim its next soul. The doors creaked open, and a cold wind rushed toward her, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and rot. The train was here, and so was Emily. She ran. Her legs moved faster than she thought possible, her heart hammering in her chest as the train roared behind her. The wind stung her face, the sound of its approach deafening in her ears. She could see the doors of the train swinging open, could feel the pull of it as if it were a force of nature, dragging her toward it. But this time, she wasn't going to let it take her. Not again. Her breath caught in her throat as she sprinted forward, her feet pounding against the earth, her mind a blur of thoughts. She was so close to escaping this nightmare, to outrunning the fate that had been thrust upon her. She could feel the light ahead, the same light that had once beckoned her before, the same warmth that had pulled her toward freedom. And as the train's cold embrace reached out for her, she made a choice. With a cry of defiance, Emily dove toward the light. The world exploded into a bright, blinding glow. The train, the figure, the darkness, they all vanished, disintegrating into nothingness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily was free. The light surrounded her, engulfing her in its warmth. She could feel the weight of the train's curse lifting from her, the pressure in her chest easing. It was over. At least she thought it was. The light was blinding, but it wasn't like the blinding of fear. It was warm, soft, gentle, like sunlight streaming through the leaves of a tree on a quiet spring morning. Emily closed her eyes, allowing the warmth to wash over her, soothing the raw panic that had taken hold of her for so long. But even in the calm, the whisper lingered, the faintest echo of the train's whistle. She could feel the ground beneath her feet, solid and real. She was no longer running. There were no tracks, no train, no figure. Just the light and the peaceful silence surrounding her. Emily let herself sink into the stillness, trying to breathe deeply and steady her mind. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, but the longer she was surrounded by the light, the less she felt connected to the world she had just escaped from. And then, in a flash, the light dimmed. The soft radiance that had once enveloped her began to dissipate, leaving behind a strange, hollow silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and her eyes snapped open. Where was she? The world around her had changed. The soft glow was gone, replaced by shadows stretching into an endless horizon. The sky, a dull shade of gray, seemed to close in around her. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, like it had been worn down by centuries of neglect. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the faint scent of something metallic hung in the air. Her pulse quickened. The whisper returned. You thought you could escape, didn't you? The voice. It was distant, but unmistakable. Emily's blood ran cold as she turned in every direction, searching for the source. There was no one there, nothing to see. But the voice was as clear as if someone had whispered directly into her ear. The train doesn't let go so easily, Emily. You've come to the other side, but the journey isn't over. You are still marked. The weight of the words hit her like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of her. Her knees wobbled beneath her, but she caught herself. The landscape, this twisted, barren place, wasn't an escape. It was just another layer, another dimension of the curse that had bound her to the train. She had thought she was free. She had believed that when the light engulfed her, she had broken the cycle. But it seemed she had only stepped into another layer of the nightmare. What is this place? Emily shouted into the void, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? The voice didn't answer immediately. It hung in the air, teasing, circling around her like a predator. She could feel it, its presence surrounding her. This place, the voice said finally, is where the lost souls wander. It is neither here nor there. It is the limbo between the train's passengers and those who have escaped it. You are here because you have been marked, because you cannot run from the train. No one does. A chill ran through Emily's spine. She thought of her time on the train, of the passengers who had come before her, all lost to its endless journey. So, this is where they go. She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The ones who didn't make it out? They're still here, the voice responded coldly. But they're no longer who they once were. They are echoes, shadows of the lives they lived before the train took them. You are not free, Emily. You are never free. Emily staggered backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She had barely escaped the clutches of the train, and now she found herself trapped in a different, equally torturous existence. A place where the souls of the lost could never rest. Was this her fate? The air around her grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay. She could hear distant, muffled voices, distorted and unrecognizable. The ground beneath her shifted again, as if the world itself was turning and twisting. The whisper echoed again, but this time it was joined by a multitude of voices, all speaking at once. The words were garbled, incoherent, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, cruel, and full of resentment. You will never escape, the voices taunted. The train will come for you again. You can't outrun it. You can't hide. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't take it anymore. The crushing weight of her isolation, the constant reminder of her fate, it was suffocating. She turned, desperately searching for something. Anything to break the endless circle of despair she found herself trapped in. And then in the distance, she saw something. A shape. At first, she thought it was another shadow, a trick of the light, or a lack of light, but it was too real, too distinct. It was a figure, tall and imposing, standing in the center of the desolate landscape, watching her. It wasn't the same figure as before. This one was different, but somehow, Emily knew it was part of the same force, the same curse that had plagued her. She felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. She knew she had to approach it. She didn't have a choice. With her heart racing, Emily stepped forward, the ground cracking underfoot with every step. The whispers grew louder, the distorted voices overlapping in a chorus of mocking laughter. But she pressed on, her feet moving despite the terror that gnawed at her insides. When she reached the figure, it turned to face her. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The figure was her. It was a dark, distorted version of herself, a mirror image that seemed to be both her and yet not her at all. Its face was twisted with malice, its eyes hollow and empty, but still, they seemed to look into her very soul. "So you've found me," the dark Emily said, her voice cold and unfeeling. "You're not as free as you think you are you?" The word struck her like a blow. "You are the train's passenger," the dark Emily continued. "You always have been. There's no escape. No matter what you do, no matter how far you run, you will always be marked. You are bound to the train, Emily. And you will never, ever be free." Her dark counterpart reached out, its hand like a cold, iron grasp around her wrist. And as Emily's scream echoed through the endless void, the train's whistle sounded again, louder and more insistent than ever before. The grip of the dark Emily's hand was suffocating, its icy fingers clamped around her wrist like a vice. Every breath she took felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was becoming thicker, harder to swallow. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the wild panic surging through her veins. She tried to pull away, but the darker version of herself was unyielding, its grip iron tight. She tugged, twisted, desperate to escape, but it was like fighting against the earth itself. The shadows pressed in on her, wrapping around her limbs, anchoring her to this twisted version of reality. "You can't escape," the dark Emily hissed, her voice cold and filled with disdain. "You've never been free. You're bound to this place, just as much as I am." The words echoed in Emily's mind, bouncing off the walls of her consciousness like the clattering of train tracks. They were too familiar, too real. She wanted to shout, to scream back at the thing that had once been her, but the words stuck in her throat, thick with fear. The figure before her smiled, a twisted, mocking grin that was all teeth and shadow. It was a reflection of the terror Emily had tried so hard to outrun, a tangible manifestation of everything she had tried to forget. You think you can change your fate? Emily's breath caught in her chest. The dark Emily's words were like daggers, each one aimed directly at the heart of her resolve. Every part of her, every fiber of her being wanted to break free, to tear herself away from this nightmare. But the whispers returned, louder than ever, crawling beneath her skin like an infection. "You are always here," the dark Emily continued, her voice growing louder, echoing in the empty space. "You can try to escape, but you'll always end up back here, at the beginning of the journey. You will always be a part of the train's passengers. Forever." Emily's pulse raced, her vision starting to blur at the edges. The words were too real. Was it true? Was there really no escape from the cycle? No way to break free from the never-ending loop of terror? The whispers seemed to swirl around her, their cold breath creeping into her ears, murmuring their dark truths. "The train is always watching," they hissed. "It knows your every move. It has claimed you." The dark Emily gripped tight, grabbed her closer, pulling her toward the abyss. Emily could feel herself slipping away, her body becoming lighter, as though the weight of her reality was no longer hers to bear. Her mind was becoming unmoored, adrift in the shifting sands of this strange place. The shadows began to grow, reaching for her, enveloping her in their grasp. But then, amidst the darkness, Emily heard something, a sound that cut through the chaos like a beacon of light. It was the unmistakable screech of a train's whistle. It sounded distant, but sharp, like the wail of a ghost calling from the depths. Her breath hitched. "No," Emily whispered. "I can't. I won't go back." The whistle grew louder, piercing the air with a sense of urgency, a force pulling at her from all directions. The shadows around her seemed to pulse in time with the sound, as though they were alive, feeding off the train's presence. The dark Emily grinned wider, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You think you have a choice?" She sneered. "You are the trains just like me. The cycle never ends." A surge of anger flooded through Emily, hot and sharp. She could feel the resolve forming in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't let herself become a part of this place. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the shadows, by the dark version of herself. She fought against the grip, pushing with every ounce of strength she had left. The shadows tried to pull her back, their icy fingers digging into her skin, but Emily refused to be dragged down again. "I am free," she spat, her voice trembling but resolute. "I refuse to be a part of this. I refuse to let the train control me." The dark Emily's expression faltered for a split second, a flicker of confusion crossing her twisted face. For the first time, she seemed unsure. Emily took advantage of the moment, forcing herself forward, breaking free from the grip that held her. Her feet moved faster, her heart racing with the adrenaline of survival. The train's whistle echoed louder, closer now, but Emily didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She ran. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, the world around her warping and twisting. But Emily kept moving forward, focusing on the sound of the whistle. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pull. It was a guide, a force that could lead her to freedom. She didn't know where it would take her, but she knew she couldn't let the train claim her again. As the whistle grew louder still, Emily burst through the darkness, her body colliding with a sudden wall of light. It surrounded her, engulfing her entirely, and she gasped for breath, her senses overwhelmed by the intense radiance. For a moment, there was nothing but light, blinding and pure. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light began to fade. Emily blinked, trying to adjust her eyes, but the world around her remained shrouded in a strange fog. She could feel the ground beneath her feet again, solid and firm. Slowly, her surroundings began to take shape, though they were unfamiliar. She was no longer in the desolate wasteland, nor was she on the train. She was somewhere else. There was no sound, no train whistle, no whispers. Only an eerie, almost serene silence. But then she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the mist. It wasn't the dark Emily. This figure was different. But Emily knew, deep down, that this was another piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the cycle that had bound her from the beginning. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its movements deliberate. As it drew closer, Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was a person, a man, but his eyes were empty, hollow. And in his hand, he held something. A key. The man spoke, his voice low and distant, as though coming from a far-off place. "The journey is never truly over," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The train has a hold on you, Emily, and it will always come for you, no matter where you run." Emily felt her heart drop. The key in the man's hand gleamed, a promise of something far darker. "But there is always a choice," he continued, his voice carrying an unsettling calm. "You can choose to ride, or you can choose to fight. But remember this, there is no turning back." The man raised the key, and the world around Emily shifted once again. She couldn't escape. Not yet. Emily stood frozen, the figure in front of her still holding the gleaming key. Its presence seemed to press in on her, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a dense fog. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The train, the cycle, the whispers, the darkness. It all felt like it was closing in on her. Each step she took drawing her deeper into a maze with no exit. The key in the man's hand seemed to glow, its silver surface pulsing with an eerie light. As his empty, hollow eyes locked onto hers, Emily's stomach twisted. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he was here, but the question seemed irrelevant. All that mattered was the choice he had spoken of. "The journey is never truly over," the man had said, his voice like the faintest echo of a dream. "The train has a hold on you, Emily, and it will always come for you, no matter where you run." Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to break free from this endless nightmare. But how? The man began to step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and Emily felt a chill rush down her spine. She couldn't keep running. She had tried. She had fought. And every time, it had been for nothing. The train had always caught up with her, pulling her back into the same cycle, the same torment. "What do you want from me?" Emily demanded, her voice shaky but defiant. The man's expression didn't change. He stood before her, holding the key like an unspoken promise. A quiet, sinister smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "The choice is yours, Emily," he said, his voice low and calming. "You can choose to ride the train, or you can choose to break free. But there is a price to pay for either path." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The train, the key, it all felt like a twisted game, a trap. But what was the price? What did it mean to break free? She had to understand. She needed to know the consequences before making her choice. "What happens if I choose to break free?" Emily asked, her voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, an uncomfortable pause that made the air thick with anticipation. Finally, he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "To break free means to sever the bond to the train, but the cost is heavy. You will lose the memories of the journey. You will lose everything that has shaped you. The pain, the suffering, the growth. You will be left with nothing but an empty void." Emily felt a shiver run through her. A void. She had already lost so much. The thought of losing more, of losing herself, was terrifying. But then, the thought of being trapped in the cycle forever was even worse. "And if I choose to ride the train?" she asked, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. The man's smile faded, his expression darkening. "The train will claim you. It will take you deeper into the cycle. You will ride it for eternity, but you will never escape. You will live out the same moments, over and over again, never reaching your destination." Emily's mind spun. Both choices were terrible. Both choices seemed like a kind of prison. The key, now hanging in the man's hand, seemed to symbolize the final decision she had to make, the moment that would decide her fate. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had come so far. She had fought so hard. And yet, the emptiness of the void gnawed at her. Was it possible to truly break free from the train? Was there any way out that didn't require losing everything? She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the train creeping up behind her, its relentless screeching closing in on her. But there was nothing. The fog was thick and still, the world around her quiet and oppressive. It was as if the train had never existed at all. The man, sensing her hesitation, took another step closer, the key now dangling in front of her face. "The choice is yours, Emily. You must decide." She swallowed hard. The idea of breaking free, of leaving the train behind, was both terrifying and enticing. But could she live with the cost? Could she give up the fragments of herself that had been shaped by the journey, by the pain? Could she truly move forward without the past? A sudden thought hit her. What if the past didn't have to define her? What if, instead of choosing to escape or stay locked in the cycle, she could find a way to forge a new path? What if she could stop being bound by the choices that had been made for her and choose her own destiny? Her gaze locked onto the key, the glint of light from its surface catching her eye. "I'll choose neither," Emily said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I refuse to let this train control me. I'll find my own way. I'll make my own path." The man's face twisted with something resembling surprise, his eyes narrowing slightly, his lips parting in a silent question. The air seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. The key in his hand trembled, as though resisting her declaration. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, the world around her began to change. The fog started to dissolve, the shadows receding as the mist evaporated into nothingness. Emily felt herself being pulled forward, drawn into the unknown. It wasn't the train she feared. It wasn't even the key she had rejected. It was the unknown, the freedom she had chosen, the uncertainty that came with it. Suddenly, the man's figure began to blur. His voice, once calm, now sounded like a distant echo, fading in and out of her awareness. "You cannot escape the cycle," he called, his words becoming nothing more than a ghostly murmur. "The train always finds you. The journey always repeats." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. She was moving forward into the dark void that stretched before her. A new path, one that was hers to shape. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration as she walked away from the man, from the train, from everything that had bound her. She was leaving it all behind, choosing her own fate. And as she walked, the last remnants of the train's grip on her began to fade, swallowed up by the vast unknown. She didn't know where she was headed, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in ages: freedom. The fog dissolved around Emily as she continued to walk, the last remnants of the strange man's presence dissipating into the ether. There was no sound now, no oppressive hum of the train or its cruel metallic screeching. It was silent, peaceful, almost, but in a way that unsettled her. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since the moment she had made her choice. The decision to break free had been simple, yet its consequences were impossible to comprehend. She had rejected the train, but in doing so, had she rejected a part of herself? The road she walked seemed endless, stretching out before her in every direction. It was a barren landscape, no trees, no hills, no signs of life. Just an open path. Her shoes crunched lightly against the gravel beneath her feet, the only sound breaking the stillness. The air was colder now, the breeze brushing against her skin like an unseen hand. As she walked, she felt something tug at her, something deep inside her chest, a dull ache. Her mind wandered back to the memories of the train, of the journey she had been on. The faces, the passengers, the darkness. She couldn't shake them. They were still with her, haunting her, even as she moved forward. Is this really freedom? She whispered to herself, her voice lost in the vastness of the empty world. Her footsteps faltered, a thought creeping into her mind. What if the man had been right? What if the train would find her again? What if no matter how far she walked, no matter how much time passed, it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting for her to return? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. Her body jolted forward as the path in front of her cracked open, like a rift in the world itself. The air grew thicker, the dark sky overhead swirling in a disorienting way. Emily stumbled, her heart pounding in her chest as a deep, guttural sound echoed from the rift. The train. It was here. For the first time, Emily felt true panic settle into her bones. The ground continued to break apart as dark tendrils reached up from the opening, twisting and writhing like an infestation. A deep rumble reverberated through the earth, shaking the very foundation of the world she had chosen to escape. She had rejected the cycle, but the cycle wasn't finished with her. From the blackness, the train's silhouette emerged, its form growing larger and larger with each passing second. The haunting screech of its wheels on the tracks reached her ears, and a cold dread flooded her veins. It was no longer a figment of her memory. It was real. No, this couldn't be happening. She had made her choice. She had rejected the train, but the train didn't care. With a gut-wrenching sound, the train surged forward, its massive form rushing toward her with terrifying speed. The world seemed to narrow as the dark beast tore through the earth, its lights blinding in their intensity. Emily took a step back, then another. Her feet felt like lead, her body frozen in place. The train, its monstrous presence, loomed over her, swallowing the light from the sky as it roared past. It's here. It's real. I can't outrun it. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she realized, with a sickening clarity, that the key the man had shown her hadn't been the way to escape. It had been a choice to continue the cycle. She had been so desperate for freedom, for release, that she hadn't considered the consequences. She had thought she was choosing her own path, but the path had already been decided. The train was not just an obstacle. It was the embodiment of fate, of a relentless cycle she couldn't break free from. It had always been here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to think she had escaped. The train loomed, its towering form now mere feet away from her. She could feel the heat radiating from it, the air swirling in its wake. The door of the train opened with a screech, and she heard a voice from within, calling her name. Emily. It was familiar, too familiar. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The figure standing in the doorway of the train was her own reflection. It was her face, her eyes, but somehow twisted, distorted by pain, by fear, by something darker. The reflection in the doorway smiled at her, and for a moment, Emily felt as though she was staring at a stranger. You can't run from yourself, the reflection said, its voice cold and mocking. The train's engine roared louder, the rhythmic thumping of its wheels deafening. The reflection in the door beckoned to her with a hand, the fingers long and bony. Come back, Emily. You belong to the train. You always have. The words sank in her chest like daggers, each syllable a knife twisting deeper into her soul. She felt the weight of them, the suffocating knowledge that maybe, just maybe, the train had never truly been something she could escape. The reflection continued to smile, the grin stretching unnaturally wide. You belong with us, Emily. This is where you will always be. Her heart pounded louder, each beat a war drum. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on her. She wanted to scream, to run, to break free, but the reflection held her captive with its gaze. The door to the train swung open wider, and the train seemed to reach out, calling her in. The world around her dissolved into a blur, the edges of reality bending and distorting. Was there any way out? Had she truly been free? With a final, desperate gasp, Emily turned and fled. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she tried to go, she felt the train's presence pulling her back, dragging her into the darkness. It had always been here, and it always would be. Emily's legs burned as she ran, each step seeming to drag her deeper into a thick fog of despair. The train loomed behind her, but it wasn't just its physical presence that haunted her. It was the unrelenting certainty that no matter how far she ran, how hard she fought, the cycle would continue. Her breath came in short gasps, her heart hammering painfully in her chest as the world around her seemed to close in. The ground beneath her feet became uneven, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow her. She stumbled, but quickly regained her balance, pushing forward through the fog that enveloped everything. She could still hear the train, the screeching wheels, the deep rumble of its engine, as it seemed to follow her every move. It was relentless, not just in its pursuit, but in the way it seemed to control the very air she breathed. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on her. But no matter how hard she ran, she couldn't escape the pull. There was something about the train, something about its power, that felt so familiar. The way it had appeared to her when she thought she was free. The way it always seemed to find her, no matter where she went. Her thoughts whirled in a chaotic storm. This can't be real. It can't be real. But as she turned around again, she saw it, right behind her, stretching on forever, the train's dark, metallic form just waiting to swallow her whole. The train had become an embodiment of the world she had never been able to escape, the world she thought she could break free from. But there was no escaping it. Not now. Her feet slowed. Was it even worth it anymore? What was the point of running when every step only seemed to bring her closer to the inevitable? Her legs trembled beneath her, and her breath caught in her throat. She felt it, this crushing weight on her chest, a pressure that squeezed the very life out of her. It wasn't the train that terrified her anymore. It was the realization that the choice had never truly been hers. Everything had led to this point, this moment. She wanted to scream, but there were no words. No sound would come. "You can't outrun yourself," a voice whispered from the depths of her mind. The train's rumble grew louder, its lights blinding in their intensity. Emily turned around, ready to face the end. But then, just as the train seemed ready to swallow her whole, the landscape shifted. The fog, the darkness, it all shattered, broken by a flash of light. She found herself standing in the middle of the street again, the same familiar train station from before. Her heart skipped a beat. The same worn wooden benches, the same gray, unchanging platform, the same empty silence. It was all the same. What is this? Emily whispered to herself. The air was still thick with tension. Her breath echoed around her like a ghost, a disembodied sound that didn't belong in this world. The train, its lights now dim and foreboding, sat stationary at the platform. Its doors opened with the same ominous groan, just as they had before. The very same doors she had once stood before, unsure of which path to take. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure again. The man, his face obscured by shadows, but she recognized him instantly. The same man from her first encounter. The one who had shown her the way. The one who had warned her. "Emily," he called, his voice cold and calm, like the last breeze before a storm. "You can't break the cycle. You can only choose your path within it." Terror gripped her heart, and she backed away instinctively, her hands shaking as she gripped her arms in an attempt to steady herself. This couldn't be happening. Not again. But I chose. I chose to leave. I didn't get on the train. I left it behind, she cried out, her voice desperate, raw with emotion. The man stepped forward, his footsteps silent against the pavement. "You believe you chose, but you don't understand. The choice was always yours, but it was never truly yours to make." He reached out a hand, his fingers pale and elongated. "Every ending is only a new beginning. and you can never outrun it, Emily. You will always be a part of the train's journey. Her mind swirled in confusion. This couldn't be true. She couldn't go back. She had been so sure that breaking free was the answer, that leaving the train behind was the key. But now, in the face of the man's words, she wasn't so sure anymore. She felt herself stepping closer, her legs moving as if guided by something other than her will. It was the pull, the force, the inevitability that had always been there in the shadows, waiting to claim her. The train had never been about escape. It had been about understanding. Understanding that, like it or not, this was a part of her. This was always where she was meant to be. You can't fight it, the man continued, his voice soft now, almost sympathetic. It's not about the train. It's about you. You, in all your struggle, trying to escape the only truth that will ever matter. There is no running. There is only the cycle. Emily took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. Was he right? Was this really how it would always be? Would she always be running from something that would never let her go? The train's door loomed before her, the invitation clear. She couldn't escape. Not now. Slowly, as if compelled by an unseen force, Emily stepped toward the train. "Step inside," the man whispered, his words pulling her closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "And see what awaits." The door swung open in front of her, and Emily took one final step, leaving the station behind. The journey continued, as it always would, and the cycle began again. As Emily stepped onto the train, the door closed behind her with a finality that reverberated deep within her chest. The sound was hollow, almost deafening in the silence that followed. She turned around, her gaze drifting over the interior of the train. Everything was exactly as it had been before. The worn fabric of the seats, the flickering lights overhead, the unsettling stillness. It was as if she had never left, as if the moment she had made her decision to walk away, to refuse the train, had never even existed. She looked around, her breath caught in her throat. The passengers, faceless figures, their features blurred by the dim light, sat silently in their seats. Some of them appeared to be asleep, others staring blankly ahead, their eyes hollow and empty. The train's rhythmic movement felt like a lullaby, a constant pulse that seemed to draw her in, weaving a strange comfort into her bones. The man, the figure who had warned her, was gone. There was no sign of him. The space felt different now, as though she had crossed some invisible threshold. She had returned, but nothing was the same. Or was it? No. She thought, her hand gripping the seat beside her for support. This is where I've always been. The realization hit her like a cold wave. It wasn't the train that she had been running from. It was the truth she had avoided all along. She sank down into a seat, her body trembling as the full weight of the moment pressed down on her. The train continued its steady movement, the scenery outside blurring into a wash of dark, shadowed forms. The endless night outside only seemed to deepen as the train sped forward. Emily closed her eyes, trying to push away the sense of dread gnawing at her. But there was no escape from it. No escape from the cold, suffocating presence of the train. Her mind began to drift again. Thoughts swirling, memories colliding, faces, places, moments in time, all blending into a hazy, nightmarish fog. She saw the faces of the passengers again, their eyes hollow, their expressions vacant. She saw their hands gripping the armrests, their fingers twitching in unison. Are they trapped too? She wondered, her pulse quickening. Did they make the same mistake? But the answer didn't come. The train moved on, and Emily's thoughts grew darker, more twisted. As she sat there, staring out the window into the endless night, the hum of the train seemed to grow louder, filling her mind with a pressure she couldn't explain. A sudden, sharp jolt threw her forward, and she caught herself, her breath catching in her throat. What was that? The train slowed to a stop, the screeching of its wheels a harsh, shrill cry in the silence that followed. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, a sickening sense of dread flooding her veins. She stood up shakily, her eyes darting around the train as if something had changed. Had it? Was it? The door at the far end of the carriage creaked open, revealing the familiar figure of the man once again. His shadowy silhouette filled the frame of the doorway, and Emily froze, her heart racing as he stepped inside, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He didn't need to speak for her to know what was coming. The atmosphere shifted as he drew closer, his presence swallowing up all the space around her. It was as if the entire train, every inch of the car, was suddenly filled with his energy, with his command. "You've come back, Emily." His voice was low, like the rumble of the train itself, but there was a strange calmness to it now, as if this moment, this confrontation, was inevitable. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her voice was lost in the overwhelming pressure around her. She felt as though she was suffocating, drowning in the silence that hung between them. "I don't understand," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I could escape. I thought I could change things." He tilted his head, his eyes gleaming darkly in the dim light. "You did escape, Emily, but you can never change what's already been decided." She recoiled, a wave of nausea crashing over her. "What do you mean? What's been decided?" "This," he said, his gaze sweeping over the passengers, still eerily motionless in their seats. "The train, the journey, the cycle. It all repeats over and over, as it always has, as it always will." Her stomach lurched, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The train is not just a place. It's a part of you, the man finished for her. A part of every soul that steps aboard. You're bound to it. Always have been, always will be. Her chest tightened, her breathing quickened as the weight of his words sank in. "But I can't live like this. I can't keep running in circles." "You don't have to live like this," the man said softly, his voice almost soothing now. "You're already here. You've already made the choice. The only thing left to do is accept it." She shook her head, tears springing to her eyes. "But Emily," he interrupted, his tone a warning. "You're only here because you belong here. And no matter how many times you fight it, no matter how many times you think you've found a way out, the cycle will continue. It will always return. You can't change your path. This train will always bring you back to the beginning." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, a hollow sound that echoed around the train car. "So that's it? I'm just trapped here forever?" "No," he said, his voice soft. "Not forever. Just long enough for you to realize the truth." The train jolted again, and Emily's gaze snapped back toward the window. A faint light flickered in the distance, signaling their arrival at the next station. The station she knew all too well. The door at the end of the car opened again, and this time, a shadowy figure stood there waiting. She could see the faint outline of the platform, just beyond the doorway. "You can go," the man said, his voice oddly compassionate now. "But it will always lead you back. Always." Emily hesitated, her heart pounding as the door stood open, an invitation to another unknown. But was it any different than staying? Was there any real escape? With a deep breath, she stepped toward the door, her eyes fixed on the figure in the distance. And as she stepped off the train once again, she heard the whisper in her mind. There is no end, only another beginning. The moment Emily stepped off the train, she was swallowed by the thick darkness of the station, the chill of the night air biting at her skin. Her feet sank into the soft earth, and she stumbled slightly before regaining her balance. Her eyes scanned the surroundings. The station, though empty, looked familiar in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. The faint, dim light from a far-off street lamp cast shadows across the cracked pavement, making everything appear warped, distorted, as if it were only a reflection of reality, something that seemed real but wasn't. This is just the beginning again, she thought, the realization creeping over her like a creeping fog. Her stomach twisted into knots. She couldn't shake the sensation of being here before, of having walked this same path countless times. She looked back at the train, the door still ajar. The passengers sat still, unmoving, staring blankly ahead. A cold gust of wind blew through her hair, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice, an echo of the man's words. "You can go, but it will always lead you back." Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart hammered against her chest. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to escape, to prove to herself that she could break free from whatever invisible chains held her here. Yet, her feet remained rooted to the ground. She knew, deep down, that no matter how fast she ran, the inevitable would always catch up with her. Is there truly no way out? She whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the silence of the station. A faint sound, a rustle of fabric, caught her attention, and her gaze snapped to the figure standing in the shadows near the end of the platform. She could barely make out its shape, the details too distorted by the darkness. The figure didn't move, only watched her. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, the quiet crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound as she approached the figure. The air grew colder, and her breath formed a mist in front of her face. "You've returned, Emily," came a low voice, barely above a whisper. The same voice that had haunted her thoughts ever since she'd first stepped onto the train. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing the man, the same man who had warned her about the train, the same one who had told her the truth she wasn't ready to accept. "I thought I was done with this place," she muttered, her fists clenched by her sides. "I thought I could leave it all behind." "You were never meant to leave," the man replied softly, his eyes reflecting the dim light like cold steel. "Not really. You've always been part of the cycle, just like everyone else who boards that train. You can try to fight it, try to outrun it, but you can't escape what's already been set in motion." Emily shook her head, her chest tightening. "Then why give me the choice? Why even let me get off the train?" He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "Because you needed to understand. You needed to see it for yourself. The train is not just a vehicle, it's a choice. A choice that leads to one of two paths, to stay and be trapped in the cycle, or to leave, only to come back when the time is right. To understand that the real escape is accepting your role in it. And if I refuse to accept it?" Emily's voice was shaky, but there was a certain defiance in her words now. "You'll return anyway," the man replied, his voice almost gentle. "You can't outrun the truth. It will always bring you back, as it has brought you here now." Emily took a step back, her mind racing. Was there no hope for her? Could she never escape this? She felt the weight of the train's reality pressing down on her, the overwhelming sense of being caught in an endless loop. The more she tried to break free, the more she felt herself slipping further into the very thing she feared. She looked at the man one last time. "Is there no end to it?" "There is an end," he said, his tone suddenly grave. "But it's not something you can force. You have to let it unfold on its own. Just like the train, just like the journey you're on." Emily stood there, the wind tugging at her hair and clothes, the night stretching out endlessly before her. The quiet hum of the train's engine still reverberated in her bones, even though she could no longer see it. It was like an invisible tether, pulling her back, reminding her of its presence. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Then show me the way. Show me how to break the cycle." The man remained silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning to the empty road that led off the platform. "The path is yours to walk. But remember, every step you take is one step closer to the truth, whether you're ready for it or not." Emily hesitated. For the first time, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't quite see, but could feel tugging at her. The man's words echoed in her mind. You can't escape what's already been set in motion. She took one final look at the train, the looming shadows of the passengers still watching her from the windows. And then, with a deep breath, she turned away from it. She took her first step into the unknown, the path before her both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. The journey was far from over, but perhaps this time she would choose her own destination. And as she walked into the night, the man's voice called out behind her, almost like a final warning. Remember, Emily, you cannot outrun the truth forever. The sound of his words faded, leaving Emily with only the echo of her own footsteps. Emily walked, the quiet of the night wrapping around her like a shroud. The distant hum of the train had faded, but she could still feel it echoing in her bones. It was as if the sound had been a part of her, a rhythm in her chest that kept time with her own heartbeat. She could still hear it in her head, still feel the pull of its promise, its inevitability. It was both haunting and strangely comforting. The road stretched out in front of her, an unbroken line leading toward the horizon. It felt endless, like there was no end to it, just as there was no end to the choices she had made. Emily's thoughts swirled like a storm inside her mind. The man's words had left a mark on her, a question that lingered in the back of her mind. What happens now? The train was gone. The station was behind her. The passengers were nothing more than shadows in her memory. But the weight of her journey remained, pressing down on her like an invisible force. She had walked away from the station, walked away from the train. But was she truly free? As she walked deeper into the night, Emily realized that the answer was far from clear. She had hoped, had wished, that leaving the train would mean breaking the cycle. But there was a heaviness in her chest, an unshakable sense of dread that she couldn't escape. The trees on either side of the road seemed to whisper to her as she walked, their branches swaying in the breeze like fingers brushing against her skin. The air had grown colder, the night, stretching longer as she moved farther away from the station. The silence seemed to press in on her, and with every step, she felt more and more alone. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold biting at her skin. The road ahead was empty, the world around her devoid of life. She could hear the rustle of the wind in the trees, the soft crunch of her boots against the ground, but everything else was swallowed by the quiet. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, she heard something. A sound, a faint creaking like the shifting of metal. She stopped, her heart racing as she turned to look behind her. At first, there was nothing, just the empty road stretching into the distance, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then, through the haze of night, she saw it. The train. It was back. The headlights gleamed through the dark, casting long shadows across the road. It came toward her with an unsettling speed, its engine roaring louder as it grew closer. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. She had walked away from the station. She had walked away from the train. But it had followed her, like it always did, just as the man had warned her. The train screeched to a halt in front of her, its doors sliding open with a hiss. The same passengers from before, their faces frozen in expressions of apathy, stared out at her. The conductor stood at the door, his eyes dark and empty. "Emily," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "You can't outrun it." Her pulse quickened. She felt the pull again, stronger this time. The train beckoned to her, its rhythm calling her back, its promise of an end that never came. But she couldn't go back. She couldn't let it take her again. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The train's engine revved behind her, its headlights flashing like eyes in the darkness, chasing her down the road. She didn't dare look back, didn't want to see it gaining on her. The weight of the train's presence pressed down on her, as though it were closing in, surrounding her. She ran faster, her legs aching, her breath ragged. The road stretched endlessly ahead of her, but with every step she took, the train was there, always just behind her, always right on her heels. The world around her blurred, her mind spinning with fear and exhaustion. And then, just as she thought she could run no longer, she felt something shift. The air around her thickened, the world around her warped, and for a split second, everything froze. The train was gone. She stopped, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she looked around. The road was empty again. The night was still. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The train was gone. But then she saw it, a shadow, stretching long and dark across the road, creeping toward her from the edge of the trees. She turned to face it, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow grew larger, more distinct until it took shape. A figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, stood at the edge of the road, watching her. The man. "It's not over, Emily," he said, his voice like a cold wind. "You can't escape it. Not now. Not ever." Emily's heart sank as the truth crashed down on her. The cycle wasn't broken. The train would always be there, waiting for her to return. No matter how far she ran, no matter how fast she tried to escape, she would always come back to this moment. She would always come back to the last train. She sank to her knees, the weight of it all pressing down on her. There was no escaping it. There was no way out. Then what do I do? She whispered, her voice breaking. "How do I stop it?" The man stepped forward, his face hidden in the shadows. "You can't stop it. You can only accept it." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emily closed her eyes, the truth settling in around her like a cold, unrelenting fog. There was no escaping. The train would always be there, waiting for her, pulling her back. And no matter how hard she tried to fight it, Emily knew that she would always return to the last train home. Weeks passed since Emily had made her choice, since she had walked away from the train and tried to outrun her fate. Life, such as it was, resumed in its dull, predictable rhythm. She lived in the same town, went to the same coffee shop, passed the same faces on the street. But something had changed in her. Something deep, something hidden beneath the surface of her everyday life, continued to gnaw at her. At night, she would often wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of the train's whistle echoing in her dreams. She would see the faces of the passengers, their vacant eyes staring back at her, and hear the conductor's voice calling her name. Even when she was awake, there were moments where she felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest, as though the train was still out there, waiting just beyond the edge of her awareness. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the train wasn't finished with her, that her life, for all its ordinariness, was just another stop along its twisted journey. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily found herself standing at the bus stop, waiting for her ride home. The air had cooled, the streets growing quieter as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sound of distant traffic hummed in the background, and the world felt normal. Yet her nerves were on edge. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced down. It was a message from an unknown number. "You can't outrun it." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, but the street was empty. The bus stop, the pavement, the lampposts, everything was still, yet her mind raced with a familiar dread. The words were the same ones the man had spoken to her. She knew, without a doubt, that they were from him. And the chilling realization settled over her like a cold mist. There was no escaping it. Not even here, in the quiet of her town, with the mundane hum of everyday life surrounding her. The train, the cycle, the inevitability, it was all still there lurking beneath the surface. As she stared at the screen of her phone, the faint sound of a whistle reached her ears. She froze, her eyes widening. The unmistakable sound, a distant, eerie call that had haunted her since the moment she first stepped onto that train, filled the air. It grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. Emily turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. There at the end of the street, she saw it. The train. Its headlights gleamed in the distance, cutting through the darkness like twin beacons of dread. The tracks, which she knew should have been long gone, had appeared out of nowhere, snaking through the night toward her. The train was coming, and it was coming for her. Panic surged in her chest as the train's whistle pierced the night air again, louder this time, as if calling her, summoning her back. She took a step back, but her feet felt heavy, as if the ground beneath her was pulling her forward. The train was gaining speed, its powerful engine roaring, as it barreled toward her. No, she thought, her mind racing. Not again. Please. But the train didn't stop. It never did. She could hear the rumble of its wheels on the tracks, the screech of metal on metal as it rounded the corner, heading straight toward her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and her hands shook as she stared at the massive shadow looming before her. And then, just as the train reached the bus stop, everything went black. Emily awoke in a dimly lit room. Her head ached, and her limbs felt heavy, as if she'd been asleep for far too long. The air around her was thick with a sense of foreboding, and her heart raced as she tried to sit up. The room was small, plain, almost sterile. A single bed, a chair, a desk with nothing on it but a lamp. The walls were bare, the floor cold beneath her feet. She looked around, disoriented, her thoughts spinning. The train, the whistle, the sound of the engine. It was all real. It hadn't been a dream. She stood up, her legs wobbling as she steadied herself. Where was she? How had she gotten here? A door creaked open behind her, and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The man stepped into the room. "Welcome back," he said softly, his voice calm, but laced with something darker. "I see you've made your choice." Emily's stomach twisted. "I didn't choose this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't want this." "But you did," the man replied, his eyes unreadable. "You always have. The train doesn't just bring you back. It shows you what you need to see, what you need to accept. You are part of it, Emily, and it is part of you." She took a step back, her mind racing. No, I'm not. I can't be. You are." The man's tone was final. "You always were. The train doesn't bring you to the end, Emily. It brings you to the beginning." Emily's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her mind reeling. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick and suffocating. She could feel the train's presence, lurking just beyond her awareness, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She tried to stand, to escape, but the man's hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was cold, unyielding. "You can't run anymore," he whispered. "It's too late. The last train has arrived." And as the darkness closed in, Emily understood. There would never be an end. There would only be the endless return to the last train. Emily's eyes fluttered open once more, but this time, there was no room. There was no familiar world around her. She was suspended in blackness, an endless void that stretched infinitely in every direction. A feeling of weightlessness surrounded her, as if she were floating in space, untethered to the world she had known. A soft hum filled the air, an echo of something familiar, distant yet close, like the faint sound of the train's engine, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. Her thoughts were fragmented, swirling like smoke in the vast emptiness. She reached out, trying to grasp something, anything, to anchor herself, but her hands passed through the void as though it were made of air. Then, a flicker of light appeared in the distance. Small at first, like a star just breaking through the blackness. It grew slowly, steadily, the light expanding as though the darkness itself was being peeled away. She could see the shape forming now, a train, gleaming in the dim light, its metal frame stretching out like an ancient creature coming to life. Emily's breath caught in her throat. No, not again. She wanted to scream, to push the vision away, but her body felt paralyzed, unable to move. The train loomed closer, its headlights piercing through the dark like twin beams of unforgiving light. The sound of the whistle echoed in her ears again, growing louder, more insistent. The train was coming for her, just as it always had. But this time, Emily understood something she hadn't before. It wasn't just the train that was unrelenting, it was her. She was part of it as much as it was a part of her. She could no longer deny it, no longer run from it. It had become her life, her destiny, a loop that repeated itself over and over, an unbroken cycle that led her back to this point, again and again. The train stopped before her, its doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. Inside, the same pale faces stared back at her, their eyes vacant and empty, their expressions frozen in time. The conductor stood at the door, his face obscured by shadows, his presence as chilling as ever. "Emily," he called, his voice distant but clear. "It's time." She didn't know how long she had stood there, just staring at him, at the train, at the faces of the passengers. Time had no meaning here, no measure. It felt like an eternity, and yet only a moment. Emily stepped forward, her legs moving as though someone else was controlling them. She felt detached, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. The doors of the train closed behind her with a soft click, and she was enveloped in the hum of the engine, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the tracks. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the train. The seats were empty, the air thick with an eerie silence. As she passed each row, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, those cold, lifeless eyes that never blinked, never moved. And then she saw him. The man. He was sitting near the back of the train, his face obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking him. He was the one who had started all of this, the one who had spoken the words that had led her here. He was the one who had brought her back to the train again and again. Emily stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but the weight of the train, of everything it represented, held her in place. "You know why you're here," the man said, his voice soft but penetrating. "You can't escape it, Emily. This is where you belong." She felt a shudder run through her, her breath hitching in her throat. "Why?" "Because you were always meant to be here," he replied. "The last train doesn't take you to an end, Emily. It brings you to a beginning. It's a cycle that has no end, only repetition. And now, you're part of it, forever." The man's words washed over her like a cold wave. And for the first time, Emily truly understood the depth of her entrapment. The train was not just a vehicle. It was a force, a pull, relentless entity that consumed everything in its path. And she had become one of its passengers, one of its trapped souls. "But why me?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "What did I do to deserve this?" The man stood up slowly, his silhouette shifting in the dim light. "You didn't do anything, Emily. You simply chose to board. You chose to come here, just as you always have." "I didn't choose this," she cried, her voice breaking. "I ran from it. I left. I tried to escape. And yet here you are," he said, his voice almost pitying. "You can't outrun something that is a part of you. The train doesn't care about your choices. It doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about its passengers." The train lurched, the wheels screeching against the tracks as it picked up speed. Emily felt herself being pulled forward, as though the force of the train's motion was drawing her in, pushing her toward the inevitable. She closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on her, crushing her from every side. "This is your fate," the man's voice echoed in her mind, a haunting whisper that lingered long after he had spoken. And then Emily opened her eyes. The train was gone. The man was gone. She was standing in an empty field, the wind whispering through the tall grass around her. The air was still, quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. But the truth was clear now. It wasn't over. The train had never left. It was always there, just beyond the horizon, always waiting for her to return. Emily turned, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had become. She couldn't fight it, couldn't escape it. She was bound to the train, bound to its endless cycle, its unyielding journey. And as the sun set behind her, casting long shadows over the field, Emily heard the faintest sound of the train's whistle in the distance. The last train home. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that something was coming, something that would sweep her away once more. She couldn't tell if she was dreaming or if the nightmare had never truly ended. The wind picked up, swirling around her as the grass bent, in strange, unnatural ways, as though it too had been altered by the weight of the train's presence. She took a cautious step forward, her boots sinking into the damp earth beneath her. The horizon stretched endlessly, and with it, the chilling thought that she was caught in a loop, forever traveling on an endless track. The train was never far. It only waited for her to acknowledge it, to return to its embrace. "You're not free, Emily," a voice whispered, echoing in her mind. It was his voice, the man, the one who had brought her here, whose words haunted her like the whistle of the train itself. She spun around, expecting to see him behind her, but the field was still, as empty as it had been before. The landscape had no borders, no definition, just an eternal expanse of flat grass and sky. Yet, deep down, Emily knew she was still on the precipice of something far greater than she could ever understand. "You'll always hear it calling," the voice continued, growing louder, wrapping itself around her thoughts. It was like a pulse in the air, vibrating in tune with the deep resonance of her heartbeat. "It's always there, always waiting. You'll never be free." "Why?" Emily cried out, her voice breaking the silence around her. "Why do I keep coming back?" The wind howled in response, as if it too were mocking her question. She sank to her knees, hands digging into the earth as tears stung her eyes. The emotions were too much, too overwhelming. She had tried to run. She had tried to fight against this unseen force, this relentless cycle of the train. But no matter how hard she fought, the tracks always led her back. Suddenly, she felt it, the faintest vibration beneath her. The earth hummed with it, the ground trembling as if the very world itself was breathing with the train. Emily's eyes widened. She looked up, her breath caught in her throat. The train was there, appearing on the horizon as though it had always been. Its outline was faint at first, then became clearer, more defined. The lights flickered into view, casting an eerie glow across the grass that shimmered in their reflection. The whistle of the train cut through the air, clear and unmistakable, and Emily knew she could never outrun it. A familiar coldness gripped her chest. She turned her back on it for a moment, hoping against all reason that it would disappear, but the sound grew louder, and the train itself seemed to grow in size. It was coming for her. The man's voice rang out again, clear as a bell. "It's time." She stood up, the weight of his words pulling her towards the train. She couldn't resist. She couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved on their own accord, carrying her forward, step after step. The train drew nearer, its massive wheels rolling forward with an inevitable momentum, shaking the earth beneath her. It was like a magnet, pulling her into its orbit. Her mind screamed, her body screamed, but she couldn't stop. The train's doors swung open, just as they always did, and inside, she saw them. The passengers, their hollow eyes, staring, never blinking. Their expressions vacant, unchanging. All those lost souls, waiting for their next journey, their next stop. She had always been one of them, but not anymore. Emily, the conductor's voice echoed through the stillness, commanding her attention. She turned to him, her heart in her throat. This time, he wasn't hiding in the shadows. His face was in full view. His eyes were dark, deep pools that seemed to look right through her, to see her soul. "You've made your choice," he said, his tone heavy with meaning. "You always have. The train never takes anyone who hasn't already chosen it." Emily stepped forward into the train, her legs shaky but determined. She couldn't stop herself, couldn't resist the pull. And as she crossed the threshold, she felt a coldness descend over her, like a blanket covering her. The train's interior was as she remembered it. Empty seats, flickering lights, and the quiet hum of the engine. She could feel the weight of all the souls around her, their eyes boring into her as if they were waiting for her to join them. "I don't belong here," she whispered to herself, clenching her fists at her sides. "I don't belong here." But the words felt hollow, meaningless, as though they were merely an echo in a vast, empty space. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, herself or the passengers. Her eyes fell to the empty seat beside her. The face of a child stared back at her, a young girl with pale skin and hollow eyes. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had seen that child before, on the train, in the field, in the reflection of the water. The child had been there in every vision, every moment. "Don't fight it," the child whispered, her voice as soft as a breeze. "You'll be like us soon enough." Emily's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the window. The world outside the train had shifted. It was no longer the field. Instead, it was a dark, twisting labyrinth of tracks, each one leading into the unknown. She was lost, and there would be no escape. The last train had arrived. The final journey had begun. The train's wheels rumbled along the tracks, their rhythmic clanging reverberating through the quiet, darkened space. The walls of the train car felt like they were closing in, as if the very air around Emily was suffocating her. The flickering overhead lights cast long, distorted shadows across the narrow aisles, making the whole space seem even more cavernous and claustrophobic at once. Emily sat motionless, her hands gripping the seat beside her, her knuckles white with tension. Her breath came in shallow bursts, as though she were holding herself together, trying to keep herself from being swallowed by the strange, all-encompassing silence of the train. The passengers, the ones who had been on the train for as long as she could remember, did not move. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, and yet they were always present, always watching. They were a part of the train, just like her. "Stop fighting it," the child beside her said again, her voice like a soft breeze that ruffled the edges of Emily's thoughts. "You're just like them, just like us." Emily's gaze darted to the child. She couldn't quite place her age, somewhere between 7 and 9, but there was something unnerving about her. Her pale, almost translucent skin, her hair as dark as the night, and her black eyes that stared straight through Emily with a chilling knowingness. "I'm not like you," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm not like any of you." The child tilted her head slightly, an almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of her lips. "You say that, but you're here now, aren't you? You're on the last train, the one that never stops. Not for anyone, not even for you." Emily clenched her jaw, refusing to respond, trying desperately to ignore the growing sense of dread in her chest. This was just a dream. This had to be a nightmare, a hallucination, a trick of the mind. It couldn't be real. The train couldn't be real. She couldn't have made the choice, not knowingly. She was just trying to escape. But deep down, she felt the truth settling into her bones. She had always known this would happen. The train wasn't a force of evil. It was simply inevitable. A cycle, a trap, a destination. The train lurched forward, the sound of its wheels against the tracks a loud, grating hiss that seemed to echo for eternity. Emily felt the sudden, intense pull of the motion as the train gathered speed, faster and faster, moving through the inky blackness that swallowed everything around them. It was like they were traveling through time itself, the past and future blurring together, no beginning and no end. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead of her, tall and dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His face was pale, almost ghostly, with sharp features and deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling coldness. "You've come back," he said, his voice low and smooth, as though he had been waiting for her. Emily's heart fluttered in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. But where would she go? The train was all there was, all that ever was. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, standing up abruptly and facing the conductor. Her voice sounded strained, desperate even. "Why am I here?" The conductor stepped closer, his expression unreadable. He seemed to glide through the air, his movements fluid, almost unnatural. "You know why, Emily," he said. "You've always known." "Stop saying that," she cried, her voice breaking. She was shaking now, the cold air pressing in around her, making it difficult to breathe. "I don't belong here." "Of course you do," the conductor replied, his tone almost sympathetic. "You've made your choice, just like the rest of us. The last train is for those who can't leave the past behind. The ones who can't forget what they've lost. His words were like daggers, each one striking her heart with cruel precision. She hadn't wanted to come back. She hadn't wanted this. Yet here she was trapped, just like all the others. The train was an inescapable reality. "I never wanted this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, as tears began to form in her eyes. She wiped them away angrily, refusing to let them fall. The conductor smiled slightly, almost pityingly. "No one does. But that's the nature of the train. The nature of the last ride." Emily recoiled, her mind whirling. This wasn't the life she had chosen. This wasn't the fate she had wanted. She had been running from it for so long, but now there was nowhere to go. As if on cue, the train slowed down, the screeching of the wheels against the tracks growing louder, more intense. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. The conductor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the window, his eyes gleaming with an eerie glint. Emily followed his gaze, her eyes widening as she saw what lay beyond the glass. The landscape had changed. The endless void had given way to a barren wasteland, a desolate city that seemed to stretch on forever. The buildings were crumbling, their foundations long eroded, yet they stood like twisted monuments to some long-forgotten age. The air was thick with dust, and the sky above was a sickly shade of orange, as though the sun had long since been consumed by the dark forces that controlled this place. "This is where we all end up," the conductor said softly. "This is the destination of the last train, the place where lost souls come to rest." "No," Emily gasped, her stomach churning with fear. This can't be real." The conductor didn't reply. Instead, he simply turned and began to walk toward the back of the train, his figure receding into the darkness. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing, her pulse thundering in her ears. The train had stopped. The journey was over. But was it really? The train came to an unnerving halt, the screech of the wheels coming to a slow stop, echoing in Emily's chest like the thudding of her own heartbeat. The doors hissed open with an unnatural squeal, revealing the vast, empty city that stretched out before her. The air tasted of metal and dust, heavy and stifling. It was a place forgotten by time, a place lost to all sense of meaning. Emily stepped out onto the cracked concrete platform, the dry air biting at her skin as she surveyed the city that loomed before her. The buildings stood in haunting silence, their decaying facades reflecting a dim, orange light that seemed to flicker from nowhere. There were no signs of life, no movement, only an oppressive stillness that wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. "What is this place?" Emily whispered to herself, her breath barely visible in the cold, stale air. Her words hung in the silence, unanswered. Behind her, the train doors closed with an eerie finality that made her heart lurch in her chest. She turned to find the conductor standing on the steps, his cold eyes never leaving her face. He hadn't spoken a word, but somehow she felt the weight of his presence as though he were silently judging her. "You've arrived," he said at last, his voice deep and deliberate. It carried a strange, hypnotic quality to it, as though it was meant to be heard, but not fully understood. "This is where it all ends. The last stop." Emily shook her head, feeling the grip of panic beginning to tighten around her throat. "No, I don't belong here. This isn't real. This can't be real." The conductor didn't respond, but his gaze grew sharper, more knowing, as though he could see the confusion and fear gnawing at her. The city stretched out endlessly in front of her, but there was no sense of direction, no purpose. The shadows of abandoned buildings loomed like forgotten ghosts, the windows darkened and empty. She wanted to run, to escape, but the thought of running in such a place felt futile. Where would she go? What would she do? This was a place beyond time, beyond reason. The child's words echoed in her mind. "You're just like us, just like them." But she wasn't like them. She wasn't meant to be here. She couldn't be. A faint sound reached her ears, something distant, like the wind howling through empty streets. Then, a low creak, the sound of something dragging against the ground, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to smother every other sound. Emily turned sharply, her heart hammering in her chest. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow move, a figure, tall and hunched, crawling across the city streets like a wraith. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the emptiness behind. Her pulse quickened. Was it real? Had it been a trick of the light? Or was there something else in the city? Something lurking in the dark corners, waiting for her? The conductor, still standing at the train door, nodded toward the city. You're not alone here, Emily. There are others. Those who have made the same journey, walked the same path. They've been here longer than you. His voice was like a cold wind, cutting through her thoughts. She clenched her fists, feeling the rising tide of desperation and dread. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. But before she could take a step forward, a sound broke the silence, the screech of metal against metal, followed by a low, guttural growl. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble. And then it appeared. A figure, monstrous and distorted, shambled toward her from the shadows of an alleyway. Its form was jagged and twisted, like a patchwork of grotesque body parts sewn together in a grotesque parody of a human being. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, its mouth stretched open into a grotesque grin that seemed to span the length of its entire face. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the creature slowly advanced, its claws scraping against the ground with each step. It was a thing of nightmares, a manifestation of the horrors that had haunted her since the moment she had stepped onto the last train. Run, she whispered to herself, her legs trembling as if they refused to obey her. But it was too late. The creature's eyes locked onto her, its grin widening in anticipation. The conductor's voice broke through her panic. You can't outrun it, Emily. There's no escape from what you've become. The creature lunged, its monstrous form leaping toward her with terrifying speed. Instinctively, Emily turned and bolted down the street, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's heavy footsteps followed her, its growls growing louder with each passing moment. She ran, the weight of its pursuit sinking into her bones, her mind screaming for her to find a way out, to wake up, to escape. But as she rounded a corner, the creature vanished, its growl fading into the distance. Emily's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cracked pavement, gasping for breath, her body drenched in sweat. What had just happened? Was she dreaming? Was she going insane? The city remained silent, cold, and empty, but the sense of dread in the air was palpable, as if the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. A figure appeared before her, blocking her path. It was a man, tall, with ragged clothes and a face hidden in shadow. His eyes glinted with a strange, knowing light. Running won't save you, the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. We're all stuck here. The last stop for those who've lost their way. Emily's mind spun. Lost their way? What did he mean by that? But before she could respond, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, the air thickening as though it was growing heavier, pushing her down. The man's eyes locked onto hers, his voice low and filled with a strange kind of sorrow. You're here now, Emily. You're one of us. There's no turning back. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as the man's words echoed through her mind. You're one of us. There's no turning back. She stared at him, the shadowed figure who had appeared out of nowhere, his presence as imposing as the city around them. The darkness seemed to close in, swallowing the air as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The man didn't move, his eyes locked onto hers with an unsettling intensity. His gaze felt as if it could pierce right through her, examining her very soul. You don't have to do this, Emily whispered, more to herself than to him. I don't belong here. I need to get out. The man remained silent, his lips curling into a faint, mournful smile. It was as though he had heard these words before, from countless others who had found themselves in the same hopeless place. You are out, he said slowly, his voice a rasp of truth. This is where the lost go. There's no exit, no escape. Emily felt a sharp pang of panic grip her chest. No, I won't stay here, she insisted, turning away from him, looking desperately around at the barren streets, hoping for something, anything, that would help her escape this nightmare. But as she turned, the world around her shifted. The streets, once empty and desolate, now seemed to stretch out endlessly in every direction. Buildings loomed over her like silent sentinels, their hollow windows staring back as if they knew more about her fate than she did. She heard a faint sound behind her, the heavy scrape of something dragging along the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to turn to know what it was. The creature, the thing that had chased her moments ago. She wasn't alone. She was never alone here. The man's voice followed her as she stumbled down the cracked sidewalk, the weight of his words sinking deeper into her mind. You can't run, Emily. The city doesn't let you leave. It keeps you like it has kept all the others. She felt her knees buckle, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward, desperate to find a way out, even as the shadows lengthened and the eerie quiet of the city pressed in on her. The man's footsteps fell and stepped behind her. There's nothing to escape. You're here now, and you will remain here. The train, the one that brought you, doesn't come back. The doors will never open again. You're part of the last train's journey. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she remembered the words the conductor had spoken. The last stop. Why? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why are we here? The man sighed, as though he had answered this question 1,000 times before, yet still didn't have the answer she sought. It's not about why, it's about how, he said, his voice distant, as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. You're here because you were lost like the rest of us. She spun around, her eyes wild. Lost? I was on my way home. This is all a mistake. The man's expression softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her arm. We all thought that, he said quietly. But we're here now, Emily. Just like everyone else who boarded the train. We're stuck in between places, lost in time. Emily jerked away from his touch, her mind racing with fear. What did he mean? Lost in time? Was this all just a dream? A nightmare? Or was it something else entirely? Her eyes darted around the city again, and for the first time, she began to see the other figures. They were distant at first, shadows like ghosts walking through the empty streets. But as she blinked, they began to draw closer, revealing the true nature of their existence. They were like her, people who had once been alive but had somehow lost their way. Their faces were hollow, their eyes vacant, as if they had forgotten their purpose. They moved slowly, aimlessly, like automatons stuck in an eternal loop. What happened to them? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to hear the answer. They were once like you, the man replied. They tried to leave too, but there's no leaving this place. Not for anyone. Emily's breath quickened, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her, their hollow eyes watching her every move. She had to get out. She had to escape. But where could she go? Every direction she looked seemed to be the same, the endless, decaying city stretching out in front of her, suffocating her with its silence. Can you help me? She begged, her voice desperate. Is there anyone who can get me out of here? The man's eyes softened, but his answer was the same as before. No one can help you now. You've already made the journey. You've already crossed the line. This is where it ends for you. Before she could respond, the distant growl of the creature from before echoed in the air again. Emily turned, her eyes scanning the darkened streets for any sign of movement. But it was too late. The creature was already close, its heavy, dragging steps reverberating through the ground beneath her feet. "Run!" the man shouted, his voice urgent. But Emily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted down the street, her legs carrying her as fast as they could, her breath ragged in her chest. She had no idea where she was going, but she couldn't stay. Not here, not with that thing chasing her. The growls grew louder. The footsteps behind her grew faster. Emily didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. The city seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Every corner she turned, every street she ran down, it felt like the same empty, desolate place. There was no escape. She was being drawn deeper into the city, into its heart. And with every passing second, the creature's pursuit grew closer. Her heart pounded, her muscles aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. And then, just as the sound of the creature's growls reached a deafening crescendo, a familiar sound cut through the air. The screeching of train wheels, distant but unmistakable. The last train. Emily's eyes widened. It couldn't be. It couldn't be the train again. She couldn't go back there. But before she could even process what was happening, a bright light flashed in front of her, blinding her for a moment. She stumbled forward, her foot catching on a broken piece of concrete. The train, the light, the end. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest as she staggered towards the blinding light. The sound of the train screeching, its metal wheels grinding against the tracks, grew louder, filling her ears with a frantic rhythm. Was it possible? Was the train coming back for her? Her legs burned from running, but she pushed herself forward, the sound of her footsteps now drowned out by the thunderous roar of the train. She could barely see, the light so bright that it felt as though it was consuming her, pulling her in. Her hand shot out instinctively, reaching for something solid, anything to stop her from falling into the blinding void of the oncoming light. But there was nothing. No ground. No safety. The train had come, and there was nowhere to run. I'm not going back there. I can't. Her breath hitched, but then, just as she was about to collapse into the light, there was a soft whoosh, and the brightness suddenly dulled. She blinked, dazed, as her surroundings shifted once again. The train station. She was back, but it wasn't the same. Gone were the cold, sterile surroundings she had left behind. The train station before her was broken, decayed. The walls were covered in soot and grime. The floor cracked and uneven. The harsh, fluorescent lighting flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the crumbling tiles. And the train, the last train, was sitting in the station, waiting. It was the same one, but it was old and rusted now, its once shiny surfaces now worn and faded by time. Emily stepped forward cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to turn away. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had seen this station before, but it hadn't looked like this. It had been pristine new, alive. Now it was a decaying shell of what it once was. A ghost of itself. And yet, the train remained. Unmoved still, silent. Her stomach twisted as she approached, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The doors to the train were open, wide open, inviting her in. She could feel the pull, the same magnetic force that had drawn her in earlier. But this time, it wasn't the thrill of anticipation she felt. It was fear. Emily. The voice came from behind her. She froze. Turning slowly, Emily found the man standing there again, his shadowed figure a stark silhouette against the dim light of the station. His face was expressionless, his eyes unreadable. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She didn't want to be here. Not with him. Not in this place. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Where am I?" His expression didn't change. "This is the last stop, Emily. The final destination. You're here because there's nowhere left to go." She took a step back, her heart racing. "But I don't want to be here. I want to leave. I want to go home." The man's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Home doesn't exist anymore," he said. "Not for you. Not for any of us. We're all part of this. There's no going back." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't choose this." I didn't choose any of this. The man stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. You were lost, Emily, just like the rest of us. And you've made the journey the same as we did. The train always comes back for the lost souls, but it never takes them home. Emily's chest tightened, her mind racing. Lost souls. The realization hit her like a brick to the chest. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't just a lost traveler caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was one of them, trapped here, a part of this endless cycle. Her eyes darted back to the train. It was the only way out, wasn't it? Or was it, what if this was the final trap? What if the train wasn't salvation, but damnation? I can't stay here, Emily whispered, more to herself than to him. I can't. The man reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. His touch was cold, as if it were the touch of someone who had been forgotten by time itself. You're not alone. You'll never be alone here. You're with all of us now. The weight of his words sank into her chest like a stone. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, her mind screaming for an answer, for a way out. But it was too late. It always had been. The train had come for her, and there was no escape. The train's doors closed behind her, its sound now deafening as the ground began to shift beneath her feet. The destination was set. No turning back. Is this it? She asked, her voice broken. The man nodded, his face now a ghostly reflection of the past. This is the last stop. Welcome home. The train began to move, slow at first, then faster as the station blurred into darkness. Emily's heart clenched in fear, but she couldn't stop herself from being carried away. The train moved through the night, past forgotten places and endless roads, but always it carried her forward into an uncertain future. And as the city faded away, a sense of hopelessness settled over her. She wasn't lost anymore. She was home. But the price of that knowledge came with the crushing weight of despair. This was where the lost souls went, and this was where they stayed. Emily sat in the shadowed corner of the train, the hum of the engine beneath her feet a constant reminder of her isolation. The walls, cracked and weathered, flickered under the dim light of the overhead lamps. Her eyes roamed the interior of the train, but it was empty. She had expected to find other passengers, lost souls, like the man had said. Yet the car was still, eerily silent. Her thoughts spiraled in on themselves. She couldn't shake the image of the station, the dilapidated ruins, the flickering lights, and that final moment when the train doors closed on her, sealing her fate. She was no longer a passenger, just passing through. She was part of it now, bound to the train. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating her thoughts. The man had said she wasn't alone, but where was everyone? Emily's heart raced, a tight knot forming in her stomach. She stood up from her seat, her feet tapping lightly on the cold metal floor. Her fingers brushed against the worn-out fabric of the seat cushions as she made her way to the front of the car. The train was still moving, the rhythmic sound of the tracks vibrating beneath her. A low, static hiss crackled from the intercom above. Emily froze. The voice was distorted, warped, and familiar in an unsettling way. Emily, it whispered. She stumbled back, her hand pressed to her mouth in disbelief. She knew that voice. It was him, the man from the station. No, this can't be real, she muttered, shaking her head. The voice continued, louder now, echoing from every corner of the train. Emily, don't you see? You are never leaving this place. You've already arrived. The station was just the beginning. This is where it ends. Her pulse quickened as she hurried towards the door at the front of the car. She threw it open, her body trembling with fear. But as she stepped out onto the platform, she was met with nothing but darkness. The same empty station, the same eerie silence, but no train. It was as though time had swallowed her whole. The weight of the silence was unbearable, and panic surged through her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned around to face the man. No one was there. The train was gone, but she was still here. What is this place? She thought desperately. her mind frantically searching for an answer. Was this some sort of twisted dream? A cruel trick? Or was it reality? The nightmare she couldn't wake from? She walked aimlessly through the station, her feet dragging, the cold wind biting at her skin. As she passed the crumbling walls, faint whispers began to fill the air, just out of reach, like voices too distant to understand. She spun around, but no one was there. Yet, the whispers remained. Her heart pounded louder, faster. It wasn't just a man's voice anymore. It was everything. The voices of the lost souls, the forgotten, all swirling together in a chaotic chorus. A dozen, 100 voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a maddening symphony of anguish. Emily. Her name echoed once more, the voice seeping through her very bones. No! She clenched her fists, eyes squeezed shut as she fought against the overwhelming pull of the whispers. She wouldn't be consumed by them. She wouldn't join the chorus. She had to escape. The sound of the train returning, low, distant, familiar, pierced the air. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The train is coming back for me. Without thinking, she ran. She ran as fast as she could, her legs burning, her breath ragged. The platform seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, an expanse of darkness that offered no reprieve. And then, the train appeared, moving towards her slowly, purposefully. Its lights were dim, casting long shadows as the carriages slid past her, as though the train were waiting, watching her every move. She hesitated. The door was open once again. It was now or never. Emily moved forward, her hand outstretched, reaching for the handle. But just as her fingers grazed the cold metal, the voice came again, closer now, clearer than ever. Emily, don't! She froze, her heart crashing in her chest. It was the man. She could feel him behind her, could sense his presence like a weight on her back. No, she whispered, backing away from the door. I don't want to go back. I don't want this. But the train wouldn't wait. It was insistent, pulling at her, drawing her in like an unstoppable current. The doors slid shut on their own, and the train lurched forward, the engine roaring to life. Emily screamed, "No! I refuse. I won't go." But it was futile. Her feet were moving of their own accord now, drawn to the train. She struggled, her hands pressed against the cold glass, but she couldn't break free. And then she realized the train wasn't leaving her. The train was taking her to the same place. Over and over again. The last stop, the end of the line, where the lost souls never truly left. Her thoughts went cold. There was no escape. Her reflection in the glass became clear, the dim glow of the train's lights illuminating her face. Her eyes were hollow, her hair disheveled. Her face was beginning to look like them, the ones who had gotten on this train before her, the ones who had never gotten off. A dark realization gripped her chest. The man was right. There was no leaving this place. And now, Emily thought, her heart heavy with the realization, I'm one of them. The train moved on, its steady rumble beneath Emily's feet growing more oppressive with every passing moment. The lights flickered above her, casting sharp shadows across the interior, illuminating the worn seats and peeling paint. She stared out the window, the world outside, just as dark as the train car. There was no sense of direction, no landmarks, no sign of time passing. Only the oppressive darkness, swallowing everything around her. Her reflection in the glass now seemed to mock her, a hollow-eyed version of herself staring back at her, her expression blank. The air in the train car felt colder than before, the weight of the silence suffocating. She tried to move, to stand, but her body felt sluggish, as if it had grown accustomed to the oppressive stillness. Her feet were heavy, dragging with every step. There was no escape. She was trapped. The whispers had started again, a murmur that rose and fell like the wind in an empty hall. At first, there were distant, indistinct fragments of voices. But now, they were louder, closer, clearer. They were all around her. Their words, though muffled, were like a cacophony of torment and despair. They felt as though they were coming from the walls, from the very air itself. Emily, Emily, come closer. You're just like us now. Her heart lurched. The voices, they were getting stronger, more insistent. Her hands began to shake, her breath coming faster. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out, but the whispers followed her, crawling into her thoughts. The words twisted, each one a reminder that she was no longer free, that the train, this journey, had become her prison. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a creak, a soft shuffle of footsteps. Emily whipped her head around, her eyes wide, searching the dimly lit car. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, just at the edge of her vision. The man, he was there again, watching her from the shadows. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different about him now. Something colder. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the machine, part of this eternal, unending nightmare. You're still here, Emily said, her voice trembling. Why? Why won't you leave me alone? The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on her, his silhouette blending into the darkness of the train. You wanted to leave, he finally said, his voice low and distant. But you never could. Not really. You were always part of it. No, Emily whispered, shaking her head. I was never meant to be here. Everyone who steps on this train is meant to be here. The man interrupted, stepping closer, his presence filling the space. You're not special, Emily. You didn't choose this, none of us did. But now you're part of it, and there's no going back. Emily backed away from him, her heart pounding, but the train car felt smaller, more claustrophobic with every step. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape. You can't keep running forever, the man said, his voice no longer sounding human, almost as if it were echoing from 1,000 voices. The train will always find you. The station will always be there. It's part of you now, a place for the lost. Emily's breath quickened, her chest tightening. Her hands gripped the back of the nearest seat, her knuckles white. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to believe it. I don't belong here, she choked out. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to be part of this. This hell. The man's lips twitched, a faint trace of something that might have been pity or amusement crossing his face. You think this is hell? He asked, his tone incredulous. This is just a stop, Emily. A way station for those who are too lost to remember where they came from. There's no end to the journey. No way off. No, she whispered, the coldness of the truth sinking in, weighing down on her like a crushing weight. I won't accept that. He stepped closer again, until his face was just inches from hers. She could feel the chill of his presence, as if his body were made of the same cold, empty space that surrounded them. You don't have to accept it. It doesn't matter. You'll stay here, just like the rest of us, until you fade away, until you forget everything and everyone, until you become part of the whispers, part of the endless cycle, like the train, like the station. No, Emily screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. I won't become like you. But even as she said it, she felt the familiar tug, the same pull that had drawn her to the train in the first place. The darkness, the emptiness, it was inside her now. She could feel it in her bones, in her very soul. She had been hollowed out, emptied, just like the man standing before her. The train began to slow, the soft screech of the brakes a reminder that their journey was coming to an end. The station ahead, though obscured in shadow, seemed to loom larger as the train neared. No, Emily whispered, her throat tight. I don't want to go back. I won't. But the train wasn't stopping for her. It was stopping for everyone, those who had already come and gone. The forgotten, the lost, and those who were never meant to leave. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, the same cold invitation as before. Emily stepped back, but it was no use. Her body was already moving, her feet no longer under her control. The train was pulling her toward it, dragging her into the next station, the next destination. There was no fight left in her. There was no escape. And as the train stopped, its lights dimming, the whispering voices grew louder, filling her mind with the familiar, unending chant. "Welcome home, Emily. Welcome to the last stop." Emily's feet touched the cold concrete of the station platform, the same platform she had seen countless times before, though it had always been a blur. But now, as she stood at the threshold, it was sharp, too real. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The darkness pressed in, like a living thing, its tendrils curling around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, the remnants of her while crumbling beneath the weight of it all. This was where it ended, she knew. The endless cycle, the endless journey. There was no turning back. She looked around, her eyes frantically scanning the platform for some sign of hope. There were no people here, not this time. The station was empty, the walls cracked and faded, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. A sense of desolation hung in the air, as if this place had not been touched by life in decades. The doors of the train slid shut behind her, sealing her in the silence. The whispers, once so loud, now faded into a dull murmur, something distant, something she couldn't grasp anymore. They were gone, replaced by an overwhelming silence. A silence that felt too heavy, too oppressive. A figure stepped from the shadows at the far end of the platform. The man. He appeared as if he had been waiting for her, his dark silhouette looming against the faded station lights. His eyes were unreadable, and his expression as cold as it had always been. "You've arrived," he said, his voice smooth, as if nothing had changed. "You're here." "Here?" Emily echoed, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. I didn't ask to be here." The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing in something that might have been amusement. "You're always here. You just don't remember. The train, the station. They bring you back over and over again. And now, like the rest of us, you'll remain here. Part of the journey." Emily's pulse quickened, her mind racing. "No, I can't stay here. I can't be part of this endless loop." He took a slow step toward her, his presence cold and unyielding. "You already are. You always have been. This station, this place, it's your home now. You can't run from it. It's inside you." The words struck her like a physical blow, and she stumbled back, her breath ragged, her heart hammering in her chest. The darkness closed in tighter around her. There was no escape. The man was right. Her thoughts raced. She had wanted so desperately to leave this place, to break free of the nightmare, but everything had led her back here, back to this station. To him, to the whispers, to the train. "No," she whispered fiercely, shaking her head. "I won't give in. I won't become part of this place. I'm not like you. I'm not like any of you." The man's eyes softened for a brief moment, almost pitying. He stepped forward again, but this time he didn't reach for her. Instead, he simply stood in front of her, a silent barrier between her and whatever lay beyond the station's walls. "Everyone says that," he said softly. "Everyone thinks they can escape. But once you step onto the train, once you come here, there's no going back. You think you're different, but in the end, you're just like the rest of us. We're all the same." The whispers surged again, louder now, surrounding her, filling her ears, her mind. The sound was unbearable, but it wasn't the sound that terrified her. It was what it meant. She had heard these whispers before. She had heard them when she was on the train, when she first arrived. She had heard them as she was drawn into this world. And now, standing here, she knew what they meant. Emily, the voices called, each one dripping with something far darker than just a whisper. "Welcome home. You can never leave." She recoiled, her body trembling. Her eyes darted around the station, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The platform stretched out endlessly, the train tracks disappearing into the void. "You don't have to stay here," the man said, his voice low, his tone filled with something almost like regret. "You can choose." Emily looked at him, her face a mask of desperation. "Choose what?" He stepped back slightly, his hand outstretched. "You can join us, become part of the journey. Or you can leave. You can leave the station. But there's only one way out, and it's a journey you might not come back from." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. She knew what he meant. She could feel the weight of the choice in the air, pressing against her chest, squeezing her lungs. The choice between surrendering to this nightmare and leaving, without knowing what would happen if she did. But leaving meant the unknown. It meant stepping into a place she couldn't comprehend. It meant stepping into the void. I don't know if I can," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's out there. I don't know if I'll be lost forever." The man's face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion that might have been sympathy, or perhaps something else. "You'll never be lost," he said softly. "Not here, not anymore. You're already part of it." With one final look, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. The whispers lingered, but they were not the same. They had changed. They no longer called to her, but instead surrounded her, suffocating her with their weight. Emily took a deep breath, closing her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt something inside her stir, something she hadn't felt since before she boarded the train. It was fear, but it was something more. It was the last vestiges of her will. "No," she thought, clenching her fists. "I'm not part of this. I won't become part of this. I'll find my way out." And with that, Emily turned away from the station's endless darkness, stepping into the unknown, choosing to face whatever waited beyond the walls of the place that had held her captive for so long. The station faded behind her, the whispers growing distant, and though she didn't know where she was going, she knew this was the only way forward. And somewhere in the far reaches of her mind, she heard a final whisper, so faint, so far away, it was almost lost in the wind. "Goodbye, Emily. We'll see you again." Emily walked, and the station's cold, suffocating air seemed to dissipate with every step she took into the unknown. The darkness around her was no longer oppressive. It was simply empty. There were no longer whispers clawing at her thoughts, no faceless figures in the shadows. The quiet stretched for miles, an eerie silence that should have felt liberating, but instead weighed down on her with its unnerving stillness. As she ventured further from the platform, the world seemed to shift around her. The ground beneath her feet became less solid, like the earth itself was losing its grip on reality. The air grew thinner, the shadows deeper. Emily stumbled, but her resolve never wavered. The man's words echoed in her mind, still fresh and haunting. "You'll never be lost. Not here, not anymore. You're already part of it." She wasn't sure whether she believed him or not, but there was no turning back now. She had already made her choice. There was no longer any train to return to, no station to catch. It was just her, the endless void, and whatever this place had in store. She paused, looking around. Where was she going? What was she meant to do now? There was nothing, no landmarks, no signs, nothing familiar. It was like she had stepped into a space outside of time, an in-between world that offered no comfort, no closure. But the pull, the need to move forward, kept her feet moving. The world seemed to distort further as she walked, the edges of her surroundings rippling like a reflection in a broken mirror. She could feel something, some kind of presence that hovered just at the edge of her awareness. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it like a watching eye, like something waiting. As she moved on, a faint light appeared ahead. At first, it was just a flicker, a distant glow on the horizon, but it grew steadily stronger, more solid. It was a soft, pulsing light, warm and inviting. For a moment, a small hope sparked within her. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe this was the end of the darkness. She picked up her pace, her heart quickening as the light grew closer. The world around her seemed to bend and twist, the shadows thinning, the air becoming lighter with each each step. It was as if the space itself was unraveling, pulling back like a curtain to reveal something waiting for her on the other side. As she approached the light, she saw that it was not a single source, but a series of lanterns hanging from posts, lighting a narrow path through an ancient, overgrown forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching up toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The path seemed to go on forever, winding through the thick woods, beckoning her forward. Emily's feet moved of their own accord. The lanterns flickered as if reacting to her presence, casting long, dancing shadows along the path. She didn't understand why, but she felt drawn to it, the warm glow of the lanterns offering a strange comfort despite the eerie surroundings. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a soft, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking in a language she couldn't quite understand, but the sound was soothing in its own way. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the bark of a tree as she passed it. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't fear, it was something else. A sense of recognition, as if the tree, the forest, had always been waiting for her. She couldn't explain why, but everything about this place felt familiar. The farther she walked, the more the world seemed to settle around her. The tension in her chest began to loosen. The darkness no longer clung to her like a weight. Suddenly she stopped. At the end of the path, just before the light seemed to fade into the trees, there was something, a figure, standing in the distance. It was a silhouette, standing still against the glow. She couldn't make out any details, but she knew it was waiting for her. A chill ran down her spine, but it wasn't the same kind of fear that had tormented her on the train or in the station. This was different. This was the kind of fear that comes with finally understanding something, with realizing that you've arrived at the end of a long journey. She stepped forward again, her feet light and unburdened as she closed the distance between herself and the figure. As she grew closer, the figure's features began to sharpen in the light. She could see now that it was a woman, her face soft and serene, framed by flowing dark hair. She wore a simple white dress, as if she were part of the forest itself, a being from another time. The woman smiled at Emily as she approached, the smile gentle and welcoming. There was no malice in her expression, no judgment, only understanding. "Welcome," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that filled the air. "You've made it." Emily stopped just before her, her heart beating in her chest. "Made it," she echoed. "Where am I? What is this place?" The woman's smile deepened, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "This is where the journey ends and where it begins again. You've chosen to leave the station, to leave the cycle. You are free now." The words felt like a weight lifted from her chest. Emily had always thought freedom meant leaving the train, leaving the station. But it was more than that. It was about stepping into the unknown, accepting what came next. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "How can I be free?" The woman's gaze softened. "You've already left. The train, the station, the people who waited for you, they were part of the journey. But you've crossed through it all. You've stepped into the forest, and the forest offers you a new beginning. But how do I know? How do I know I won't get lost again? How do I know I'm not just walking into another trap?" The woman's eyes filled with a deep, ancient understanding. "Because, Emily, it's not about knowing. It's about trusting. You can't control what happens after you leave, but you've made the choice to walk your path. And that, in itself, is the answer." Emily took a deep breath. The fear that had clung to her for so long was fading. The path before her was unclear, but she felt something she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever hope. The woman's words sank into her, and for the first time in a long while, Emily realized that she was no longer running. She was walking forward, choosing to step into the light, into the unknown. "I'm ready," she whispered. The woman nodded, her expression serene. She reached out and touched Emily's gently, and then, with a soft calm, ahead, Emily the lanterns glowing stronger, guiding her steps. As Emily walked into the light, she felt herself shedding the weight of the past, the endless train rides, the station, the voices. They were all fading now, replaced by a new dawn, a new beginning. The woods stretched on before her, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt welcoming. And in the distance, she heard the soft sound of birds chirping, the breeze rustling through the leaves. And for the first time, Emily felt at peace. The journey had ended, but in truth, she had only just begun. Emily walked forward, her footsteps lighter than they had ever been. The forest around her stretched on like a living painting, bathed in the soft, warm glow of lantern light. She could still feel the pull of the path ahead, the draw of something greater just beyond the trees. The woman, who had welcomed her so gently, stood still for a moment, watching her, but then slowly began to fade into the shadows. It wasn't that she disappeared, exactly, but rather that she became one with the forest, her presence blending seamlessly with the trees and the soft rustle of the leaves. Emily didn't feel abandoned. On the contrary, it felt as if the forest itself was offering her its protection, its guiding hand. The further she walked, the more the world around her began to change. The trees grew taller, the foliage denser, the air cooler. It was as though the landscape was shifting with her, responding to her every step. The path twisted, meandered, and then suddenly opened up to reveal a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood a well, ancient stone, covered in moss, and surrounded by flowers that shimmered under the moon's pale light. Emily approached cautiously, her heart beating just a little faster. There was something about this place, something that beckoned her forward, yet made her hesitate at the same time. She could feel it now, a weight pressing in on her, a choice, a decision. The well seemed to call to her, its depths unknowable, its waters dark and still. She stood at the edge, staring into the abyss, unsure of what it meant or how she was supposed to interact with it. What now? She thought. A soft breeze stirred, whispering her name, and Emily stepped closer. The stones of the well were weathered, but they held a strength that seemed beyond time. Her fingers brushed against the edge, and she felt a strange warmth seep into her palm. It was like the well was alive, like it was waiting for her to do something. Without fully understanding why, Emily knelt down beside the well and peered into the depths. The surface of the water remained undisturbed, but in the stillness, images began to form into rippling reflections. She saw the train again, its endless tracks stretching off into infinity, its lights dimming and flickering. The station appeared, half shrouded in mist, its walls crumbling like ruins of a forgotten place. She could almost hear the muffled whispers of people she'd once known, people she had left behind. But then the water shifted and the images began to change. The train faded, the station dissolved, and in their place, there were new visions. Visions of open fields, wide skies, and a distant horizon filled with possibility. It was a future, one without the crushing weight of endless travel, one where she could step forward into whatever came next. As the images swirled and changed, Emily's heart tightened with a sense of finality. She realized in that moment that the train, the station, the cycle of her life, they had all been part of her past. The well wasn't just showing her a choice. It was showing her her future, free from the chains that had bound her. I can choose this, she thought. I can leave it all behind. The water began to ripple again, and this time, the reflection of her own face appeared in the depths. Her features were softer now, her eyes clearer, her expression no longer burdened with uncertainty. She was different. She had grown, evolved, and here, in this clearing, she realized that she had already left her old life behind. With one final, steady breath, Emily reached out and placed her hand into the water. As her fingers brushed the cool surface, she felt a pulse, a shock of energy that vibrated through her entire being. It was as if the well had accepted her, had opened up to her in a way that only this place could. And just like that, the world shifted again. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble as the trees around her bent and twisted, their branches reaching upward in a sweeping arc, framing the night sky above. It was as though the forest itself was wrapping her in its embrace, guiding her forward into the unknown. The moonlight bathed her in its glow, and the breeze grew gentler, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers. In that moment, Emily understood. The station, the train, all of it had been part of her journey, but this was her true beginning. She was free. Emily stood slowly, her body steady now, her mind clear. The well, the clearing, the forest, they were all behind her now. Her path lay ahead, a new horizon, a new chapter. She was ready for whatever came next. She took a step forward, and the world around her opened up, revealing a path lined with trees. The lanterns flickered gently in the distance, and the night seemed to sigh in quiet satisfaction. It was time to move forward. Emily never looked back. The forest faded behind her, but the feeling, the deep, resonant sense of peace that filled her, stayed with her, like an unspoken promise. The path stretched before her, endless yet full of possibility. There was no turning back now. She was free, and as she continued to walk, the light of the lanterns glowing softly in the distance, she knew that she had made the right choice.